Today's July 8th, 2019. I'm really honored to welcome you, Steve Blank, to the Computer History Museum to have this first session of your video oral history.
Thanks for having me.
My name is Marguerite Gong, Hancock, and on behalf of the museum and the Exponential Center which I lead, we are thrilled to have you. We want to really begin at the beginning and ask for the record, when and where were you born?
So I was born November 30th, 1953 in New York City.
And if you could tell us, you were raised, I believe, in Brooklyn. You tell us about your family and who they were and the beginning of the story, which really set.
I was actually born in Manhattan and raised in Queens,
Okay.
in
Thank
New
you.
York. My parents were immigrants to the United States, and I only understood their history much later in life, which is actually it kind of made the point that survivors tell the tale. My mother's mother had gotten pregnant by some itinerant Russian soldier passing through her village who had promised her he was going to send for her from America because he got on a boat and left. And her cousins in New York would send letters back to my grandmother saying, he's living with some other woman, he's never going to send for you. And my mother is now born, and my grandmother's raising her in a town outside of Vilna, Lithuania, called Izashuk. And so my grandmother and a cousin finally decide, well, they're going to save up enough money and go to America and find her husband, and darn it, she was going to get him back. And so she gathers up her belongings and heads over to the port. And then just as they got to the port, my grandmother remembers that she forgot to dig up some gold she had buried or something. And her cousin goes, well, there's the port. We need to go. My grandmother says, you get on that boat, there'll be another one. Goes back to her village, digs up the gold. And it's August 1914 and World War I starts. And for, I guess, 5 years, they're trapped in Lithuania, Russia, Germany, etc. Russia surrenders, but then the Russian Civil War starts. And my mother remembers being 8 years old, smuggled out in a hay cart with bayonets going past her face as they're sticking it in, looking for people being smuggled out, make it to the United States. And I think this is a little part of my entrepreneurial gene. Is the family lore is. My grandfather meets my grandmother at Ellis Island. My mother still remembers getting her first ice cream and what Ellis Island looked like. We went back with her when our baby was born, when Ellis Island opened up, and she was able to describe exactly where she was standing. But the entrepreneurial part is my grandmother gets taken to where he's living and realizes there's another woman there. And the next day, my grandfather goes to work. My grandmother doesn't speak a word of English, moves my mother and my grandfather out of the house, gets an apartment in New York, and they're now living like together in not a happy marriage. And I tell you this for one interesting reason. One is the village called Izashuk is the village memorialized in the Holocaust Museum, and it was the only one that was documented with 1,000 years of history, because there once was a town, 1,000 years of Jewish ghetto life in Europe. My father, history was even more interesting. He was born in what was then the Ukraine and then Poland, kind of in that border area, and he came over in the mid-1930s with his father. He was the oldest of 6 or 7 kids, and the traditional immigrant experience was then the father came over with the oldest son, worked, got money, then sent for the rest of the family. And he met my mother at a Socialist Workers' Party dance in New York City in 1937. And he falls in love and says, I want to get married, to his father, who's here in the States. And his father says, what, are you crazy? You don't have money to get married. We have to bring our family over. And my father says, no, we want to do this. It's really important. I want to. And so my parents had saved this letter their whole lives. It was in Polish, and it wasn't until I was in my 30s or 40s that I got it translated. And it was a letter. Obviously, he sent a letter to his mother asking his mom for her advice and opinion of, should he get married now, or should he not get married and bring them over now? And of course, his dad wanted them now, and my father wanted to get married. And his mother, the letter said in Polish, don't worry, we'll have plenty of time. And of course, they got married, and 3 months later, Hitler marched into Poland, killed the entire family. And so my parents lived their entire life with this tension of they both killed my father's family by getting married. And so I didn't understand why it was kind of a crazy household. So this is how did I grow up? I grew up with it was somewhat like an outpatient clinic. It was, you never knew what was going to happen. My parents got divorced when I was 5 or 6, and I went through, for the first 20 some odd years of my life, thinking it was my fault, which all kids do when parents get divorced. But even more so, I never understood what was the tension driving my parents, because my father, after World War II ended, spent years or decades searching for any signs of surviving of his family, and of course they were all gone. And so my upbringing was pretty chaotic. I never knew what was going to happen the next day. When I was raised by a single mother, sometimes I would get food, sometimes I wouldn't, sometimes she'd be home, sometimes not. There was a term latchkey kid where we lived in an apartment, and I would take care of myself. So I was pretty dysfunctional, just trying to, what I would now say in hindsight, in survival mode, maybe PTSD for a kid. So I don't even remember much of anything before college. Very few friends. In fact, my best friend I remember going to the public library in my corner in Queens. I must have read that entire library. So for me, library and books were kind of a safe haven of there was certainty, there was a librarian, things were in order, and you could assimilate a lot of data. So that was kind of my home life growing up.
Did you have siblings or
my
other
sister?
people in
I
the
had one
neighborhood?
sister who was 12 years older than me, and so I didn't really meet her till I was 13. I mean, I kind of had vague memories of her, but she left home because it was so crazy. She said, I had been blessed by only having one parent. She had to grow up in a house with 2 crazy people. She ran away from home when she was 16. So I must have been 4 or 5. Actually, it was probably 4 at the time. So I didn't meet her till I was an adult. So it's less so a sister and more so somebody I kind of admired for a while. The interesting connection was her husband, her second husband, was a researcher at IBM named Maurice Carnot, who invented something called the Carnot map, which in the 60s and then later on with the logic gates again became important. And so I used to visit his lab at Yorktown Heights in IBM when that was IBM's premier research center in my teens and early 20s. And that must have implicitly kind of imprinted some kind of computing is a great idea, though very unconscious, and never thought about it till much later in life that this computer stuff looked like a pretty good gig, because he would just sit in an office, and back then he had a terminal, which was an amazing concept at the time. So that was my home life.
And did you have topics as you sought refuge in the library?
I
Certain
love
things
science.
that were early passions were?
I love science. Always liked to read. Reading was though I remember early on realizing I must have been about fourth or fifth grade that I was partially dyslexic, and I never understood the word till much later in life. I couldn't tell the difference between the letter S and C, and I never. People would say, "Well, no, that's not," and what? And still to today, I didn't realize that was a thing, that you could be partially. I just couldn't see what other people saw. So reading was hard, but I managed to power through it. I now in hindsight realize, while most kids were able to process and have social lives, etc., I was just processing, trying to not get killed at home. And I always thought of myself as kind of the dumb kid. And in New York City, in high school, every kid took an equivalent of an SAT called the Regents Scholarship exam in New York. And of course, you knew where all the smart kids were going to be. And I was in a high school that had 1,000 people in our graduating class. And so when the Regents test results came out, I started looking from the bottom up. And I must have been there for about 20 minutes until one of the other kids elbowed me and said, "Blank, what did you do to cheat?" And I was number 5 in the school. And I went, and of course it was a scholarship to any college in New York, but I wanted to go to the furthest place from home I could get to. And I got a scholarship. I thought I was applying to the University of Michigan and accidentally applied to Michigan State. I had
Big
seen
difference.
some team out there. Right, it's a big difference. Even now, but back then, even more of a difference. I mean, obviously different schools. I had seen a football game on TV and thought that looked pretty cool, and wherever it was, and ended up getting a scholarship to Michigan State University. But it was the furthest thing I could think of from New York City.
Before we get to your college years, I want to ask you about your relationship with school. For kids who are literally just surviving, school is difficult, and yet you were able to test well. What was school like for you in those earlier years before you went to college?
So in New York City high school, the grades were numeric, and a passing grade was 65. And so just to give you an idea of where my head was at is that you took 5 classes a semester or quarter or whatever, and you had to pass all of them to graduate, and passing was 65. And so the last year I got 4 65s and 1 98. And the 98 was in the first computer science class ever offered in New York City. So I would say I kind of shut down in most stuff, but was able to barely pass. But when I got interested to something, I really got interested, and I think that's both half PTSD and half Asperger's, which was probably a great combination of what would describe me as of how I process stuff. I've shut down on most stuff. I was interested in history, interested in science, terrible in math, have no capacity for languages still. But that was kind of my school time.
Let's talk a minute about your early interest in technical things. You mentioned your early influences, and then this class,
Yes.
this first class. Can you talk about
Yeah.
your awareness of computing or about this technology
That's really
world?
interesting. It's in hindsight, it was kind of a major influence along with my brother-in-law at the time. New York City had just instituted a programming class in a report writing language called the RPG, which was an IBM report formatting language. And they had terminals inside of a computer science classroom, at least in this high school I went to in Queens. And so we would, type in little programs and reports would come out. But one of my friend's father worked for I think the New York Daily News or something, and they had just bought an RCA Spectra 70 computer. And so we
Wow.
would sneak in on the weekends and do punch cards on IBM 29, it's amazing to imagine we had a byte on a card. I mean, it was just like, but I learned how to key punch and learned how to run programs there. And so I think it gave me maybe an above average exposure back then. And probably early. I wouldn't say I was a hacker, but I was curious and, loved to play around. And that was my early exposure to computers. So IBM Spectra 70s. My brother-in-law was on probably the biggest 360 they had at the time at Yorktown, a 360 95 or 92 or something, or maybe it was a 360 65, but it was one of the first time-sharing machines at Yorktown. It was kind of fun.
So you, by the way, my husband and I spent a year in Michigan, so I'm well aware of Michigan State and University
Well,
of
that
Michigan.
was a cultural shock.
So how was that going from, New York to Michigan and Michigan State?
Yeah, so I remember that summer. I don't know what I did at home, but my mother and I were so happy each other were being separated. She drove me to the airport and literally dumped me off. I remember getting to Michigan with like one little suitcase, and kicking my other back, literally down the street, moving into a dorm, and meeting people from walks of life, like I had grown up in essentially a Jewish ghetto, even though it wasn't physically like that. Was suburban area of New York City. But meeting people who were farmers, and I mean, truly cherry farmer from wherever, and my roommate was from a little town called Standish in Michigan, which had like 45 people. He lasted 2 weeks, in the university. I mean, so a whole set of culturally diverse people. But I remember my first evening in that dorm, I met a guy who still affected my entire life. and that was someone named Michael Chris. And Michael, I'll just give you the short version, from the day he showed up in college, had a profound belief that he wanted to do public service, and that he was going to dedicate his career to make other people's lives better. And people who knew him in high school knew him. I mean, he was the head of the class. He was one of these all-around great guys. I mean, wasn't a jock, but I mean, just like magnetic personality. And Michael, for some reason, him and I just kind of clicked. It was this different. He grew up in a little town called Adrian, Michigan, which between Toledo and Ann Arbor. And I got to know all his friends from Adrian. In fact, one of my first girlfriends was from his town. And but just an amazing guy. And Michael ended up being the best man at my first wedding. And when I went into the military, which we'll talk about later, Michael went to law school, graduated, joined Georgia Public Services. And when I came back and I was in Silicon Valley, my second year here, I got a phone call from someone who was trying to track me down. And Michael had been killed in a head-on accident. And his wife and the kids who were taken to camp survived. But my whole life, when I started to get back into service, Michael had always told me when I was in the military, national service is great, but there's a higher calling, a public service. And so when I retired and started doing service, I think a lot of Michael Chris was still in the back of my head. And when I became a public official, I would always think about what would Michael Chris do. So talking about early influences in my life, we only knew each other maybe intensely for a year or two, and kind of casually via letters and before email for a couple of years after that. But it's amazing how someone could have that kind of influence in your life. So that was my first year in college. I had a girlfriend at the time who actually became my first wife, and she was working hard. She was became an art historian and a professor ultimately at Michigan State, and I couldn't care less about being in school. I had no idea I was there. Good Jewish boys went to college and became either accountants or doctors, and I was not interested in either one of them. And I was screwing around and doing typical college stuff. In fact, for me, college was the first time I had a social life, and like most kids, you kind of explore drugs and sex and check. Mm-hmm. But school was the last thing I wanted to do. And I still remember her words to me is, some of us are working our ass off to be here. Why are you here? And so, well, why don't you do something else for a while? And I remember that was like the first time someone gave me permission that I didn't have to be my parents' child anymore. And that's what I remind my students now is the day you step out of your parents' house, you have to make a decision is, are you still your parents' child, or is this the first day of your life? And that's when the switch went on for me that said, this is my life. I don't know what I'm going to do, but it's not here. And so I stuck out my thumb and hitchhiked to Miami, Florida, because Michigan in the winter, that winter was 40 below zero. I'm like, what? Below what? New York City has winter, but I had never, my short life back then, I had never seen 40 below zero. Lansing, Michigan could have been in the middle of Alaska. It's probably warmer there. And so I thought, where was the warmest place I knew? And I knew someone from high school.
Were you around 19 at this age? When did you drop?
I was 17.
17.
Yeah, I went to college when I was 17.
17?
So this might have been 17, maybe my 18th birthday. So I just turned 18.
Just 18. You dropped out.
Hitchhiked to Miami.
Heading south, all the way to Miami.
And then just before, and this has been kind of the story of my life, is if you show up a lot, stuff happens. My next to last ride, I still remember, was in a VW bus right out of the 60s. This is 1971, with some guys who were living in a commune. And they said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to be staying with my friend in a dorm at University of Miami. And they said, well, look, you never know what happens. Here's our phone number in case you... Phone number? So I stuck it in my pocket. And I show up in my, quote, friend's dorm. It says, oh, no, you don't want to stay here, do you? I just had to throw out the last person who was here, who said they needed a night, who was here for the last month. And I went, and so I stayed a night and had this phone number in my pocket. And called the number, and they said, "Oh, we'll come pick you up, blah, blah, blah. You could sleep on the couch." And so it was, they lived 434 Alcazar in Coral Gables. And it was like a bunch of guys and women living together, and they were Nichiren Shoshu Buddhists, and there was a little shrine, and they were chanting. But I remember I was exhausted, slept on the couch, and the next morning, I remember being slapped on the side of the thigh with one of the guys saying, "Hey, we're going to go to work. You want a job?" And, well, sure. I had been working since I was 14. My mother never had any money. We were, maybe at the top end of poor or lower end of middle class. My mother was a bookkeeper. I think made $110 a week, probably a week. Never had any. I didn't even know what an allowance was. So I went to work at 14 and lied about my age.
What was that first job?
I worked in a dry cleaners, and so I know how to bag dry cleaning. If anybody ever has that problem, I could do that. But I lied about my age. I told them I was 16 because that's what you needed in New York for a work permit. In fact, when the draft came out, I had to lie and tell them that, I had a low lottery number because why are you still here? And so made pocket money. So I was used to working at paper routes and whatever, but for me it was more about survival, to buy comic books and whatever. In fact, I have to tell you, I learned how to read both in the library, but before that, by reading comic books in the candy store. We didn't have any books in our house. My mother really didn't read except for the entertainment section of New York Daily News. So I first learned how to read by reading every comic book on the rack. They kind of got used to me being a fixture in the corner of the candy store, and then discovered the libraries. But anyway, where was I? I kind of lost.
So you were just saying they whacked you up and said, let's go to work.
Work wasn't for me, work was really kind of interesting. So where were we going to go for work? I don't know. We pulled to Miami International Airport. Well, what are we doing here? Well, we work converting cargo planes into transport for racehorses. And they basically flew racehorses up and down the East Coast, depending on the season. And now they were building stalls inside this cargo plane so the racehorses could be transported back up north for the next season. And then some other jobs were, refurbishing planes and whatever. And so I kind of fell in love with airplanes, but unlike other guys who wanted to be pilots, I was just blown away by how did they fly? What was this radar stuff? Tell me about the instruments and whatever. And finally, I bugged one of the guys who were in the repair shops, and they gave me manuals to take home, and I started reading about this stuff, and I said, how do I learn how to fix this? And I remember somebody saying, "Kid, if you're not going to go to college, the only way you could ever learn this stuff is you need to join the Air Force." There's a war on. Are you out of your mind? Well, no more than, 6-7 months later, I joined the Air Force in the middle of Vietnam.
Because of your interest in electronics, or were there other factors that led to that?
If you would have asked me 20 years ago, I would have said, it was the working at the airport and exposure to airplanes, which I had never seen up close before. Had been on an airplane once to meet my sister when I was 13, who lived in Washington. But I'd say something else was going on. Maybe now, later in life, I was always pretty good operating at a different level that I couldn't articulate. And what I realized I needed in my life, which I never had growing up at all, was some type of discipline and framework. And you hear the story a lot about kids who are lost, who join the military, or some type of structured organization. And it's not just a Steve story, it is a repeatable pattern. And whether it's a civilian work program or some kind of program, the ones who instinctually have some kind of neural net running in the back go, this life isn't going to end up well unless I get this. And since I didn't have a mother who essentially abandoned me in place, no structure in my life, I was looking for some kind of structure, and boy, did I get it. And I got it in a funny way, is that the military both gave me structure and the ability to focus, but in a war zone, it gave me the ability to kind of discover what my real talents were. And that was a real surprise for everybody. And
We talked about the change in culture
Yeah.
from New York to Michigan,
Yeah.
but from a freestyle life,
Yeah.
freewheeling lifestyle and a commune to go to the military, that is another dramatic change.
I'm
How did you
pretty
make
good
that?
at context switching.
Yeah, how did that?
By the
how
way,
did that
one of the
happen?
other interesting things I did in Miami, besides like have a great time and drugs and whatever and blah blah blah, is one is there was the Republican National Convention in '72, riots in the street. It was actually a lot of fun. But the most fun was going up and seeing, I think it was Apollo 16 launch. And so we hitchhiked up to Cape Kennedy, sat on the beach across the Banana River. And I think it was Apollo 16 because it took off like noon or 1. And I know this because we camped on the beach, got up, stood in the water, and until the Saturn V took off. And I got probably 3rd-degree sunburns for I mean, literally, I still have scars. But I have to tell you, there are still people who remember a Saturn V launch. I still remember it was like watching the Statue of Liberty take off. Even 5 miles away or however far it was across the river, this thing looked like a skyscraper. And what was very weird is you saw it lift off, and you didn't hear anything because the time it takes the sound to travel. And instead of like you would expect a gigantic roar, the first thing I remember is my chest starting to vibrate. And I think it was the infrasonics coming across the water, just like, and it was a visceral feeling. And I still remember that experience.
You're describing in such detail. You not only have the scars on your back from those 3rd-degree burns, but clearly it's burned into your memory. And why is that?
As I said, I don't remember anything before going to college, so it probably means I have a lot of room in those neurons for extra space. I still remember the downlink frequencies of the telemetry from the Soviet SS-18. So or remind me, we'll talk about the Computer History Museum Computer Bowl, which, I won twice, and I was the MVP twice. So I have this funny capacity for retaining arcane random facts, God knows why. But anyway, I came back and I realized we were talking about structure, is that I implicitly understood I needed structure in my life. And there was a war going on, and, I would have thought, and still think of myself as kind of liberal, but for some reason there was an overriding thing that I needed something in my life. And if I would have been smarter, I probably would have figured out what other civilian programs were available, but the military was pretty clear. And I'm deathly afraid of the water, so that ruled out the Navy. I was at least smart enough to realize, Army. Well, there's only one place you're going if you join the Army. And Marines, there's certainly one place you're going. Air Force, yeah, planes. I was kind of attracted. And Air Force electronics. And so I kind of visited a recruiter in Jamaica, New York, a part of Queens, and got some literature and whatever, and was living with my sister and her husband in Yorktown Heights and painting their house for the summer. But I'd already been talking to a recruiter and told my sister I was going camping for a month, and took the aptitude tests to get into the Air Force and nailed a couple of things where, again, what a surprise. I was actually pretty good at stuff. Guy looked at my scores and said, "Oh, what would you like to do?" I said, "Well, electronics. I want to work on computers." Thinking I'll work on big mainframes like that RCA Spectre 70, or maybe, if the military has IBM 360s. And the guy checks the box of electronics. He said, "Just tell them you want computers. I already checked the electronics box. They'll give you whatever you want." I think the world of recruiting hasn't changed even in Silicon Valley since then. Because, of course, I wasn't going to get to tell him what I wanted, but at least he managed to put me in an interesting area. So I got to basic training, and again, my sister and brother-in-law think I'm out camping. And meanwhile, people are getting letters from parents and whatever, and I'm not getting any letters because I didn't tell anybody where I went, because I had thought in my head, well, maybe I can't hack this. So if I can't hack it, no one will know where I was. I'll just get discharged or something. I don't know how it worked, but like, why tell anybody? And I have to tell you, this was again luck. Got to basic training, which was in Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas.
Can you tell us roughly your age and year?
It's August 8th, 1972, and so I'm 18 years old. So I'm 18 years old in basic training, and you get off the bus and you're late at night and you flew in from different parts of the country and they assigned you, to your training squadron. You get on a big bus and people get off at different stops depending on what squadron they told you. Right out of the movies, you're on this bus, it's late at night, bus makes the first stop and first squadron gets off, not ours. I look out the window and like a 6'1" drill sergeant is screaming at the guys who get off. And I'm going, what did I get into? Bus goes to the next stop. Next group gets off. There's even a bigger drill sergeant right out of like Apocalypse Now or whatever that move, those war movies, in people's face. And I'm going, oh man, I'm glad I'm going home. I'm going to figure out how to get out of here. It's our stop. We get off and I'm like almost wetting my pants. Who's going to be? I still remember. A 5'2" sergeant comes up, Sergeant Gonzalez, the sweetest guy you've ever seen, says, gentlemen, can you please get in line? and it was great. And the other thing I remember about basic training is I was just poorly out of shape. I mean, I couldn't even run a mile. And of course you had to do that for the past, combat stuff and whatever. But you had to run a mile, and I managed to get out of it the first time, and the second time there was like a makeup thing, and I went, and 4 other guys went, and there was one African-American guy who was incredibly fast. Around the track, you had to go around 4 times. And I was with the other 3 kind of like slow guys, and I said, watch this. And so the guy like laps us, and he's like, not only laps us, he's a lap and a half ahead of us. And as he finishes his lap, we're right behind him, but a lap and a half behind. I go, yes, we're done. And the guy goes, you only ran 3 laps. I said, no, you ran 5. and like the drill sergeant had no idea. He said, thank you very much, and signed off. That was the first hack I did in the military. So I get out of basic training, and you get assigned to what your specialty is. And I thought, I asked for computers, and I was going to be working on mainframes. And I look and it says electronic warfare. And I went, what on earth is that? And I'm assigned to Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi, which is, back then, and I assume maybe now, the Air Force had the world's best vocational training program in the world. It was spectacular. In hindsight, even, it was still spectacular. I think it was about 9 months of vocational training, half theory, and then half hands-on practice on some real equipment. And I learned really the basics of electronics. Again, I could have been a great TV repairman by the time I got done, but also got to run my first large-scale marketing experiment ever, because I was still a little bemused about being in the military. I didn't quite understand why people were yelling at you one day, but now we're in school. And so the Air Force Base for Keesler was kind of this mix between command and control, but also you're in educational things where you can ask any questions, but you got to follow orders, which was a little bizarre. And you should understand there were 10,000 people on this training base at a time in 30 what were called squadrons, 30 buildings of 300 each. And every Friday, the squadron would kind of meet in the courtyard to get final instructions for the weekend, and then like a school, we were dismissed. Go have a great weekend. But there was always some little lieutenant who maybe just got his bars, 21 or 22 years old, that would stand up and give us our, briefing for the weekend. And the other thing is every squadron had a bulletin board of like things you were supposed to read. You had to read this bulletin board and mostly it took 5 pages to say no smoking in bed or, like something very military ease. But there was always these official orders. And the other thing to think about is that they would rotate people who had to be think of it as it was called a fire warden, but think of that as a manual smoke alarm. Before they had smoke alarms, they had people walking around every room at night to make sure no 19-year-old was smoking in bed, catching the building on fire, seriously. And so that would rotate between random people, and one night, I was the fire warden. But when they made you fire warden, they gave you access to that lieutenant's office, which had a typewriter and the base letterhead with the letterhead of the base. Now, you remember my story about loving libraries? Well, this Air Force base, Keesler, had the world's best technical library. And so I would spend spare time there and discovered Scientific American. And Scientific American had a great article about a prank that was pulled on Caltech about 5 or 10 years earlier, and I'll tell you what it was in a second. But I wondered, would that prank work on a military base? And so I took that prank, typed it up into Militaryese, made 30 copies of it, and got the keys to our bulletin board and snuck out, abandoned my post, which was like, unbelievably bad, and put this fake order from the base commander in 30 different buildings. And this was a Wednesday. And I thought people would read it and laugh and ha ha ha, but no one said anything. No one said anything on Wednesday. No one said anything on Thursday. Friday comes by. We're about to have our 300-person meeting and other 30 buildings that's going on as well. The lieutenant comes out and said, blah, 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 blah. Any questions? And again, no one ever had any questions because we all want to go, party for the weekend. One guy raises his hand and says, sir, about the memo from the base commander about turning off gravity to work under the buildings. Does that mean what about our fish? Will they float to the... I had typed up a letter that said, from the civil engineering group, gravity will be turned off this weekend. And so here are the tie-down instructions. Please no footprints on the ceiling and whatever. And all of a sudden, 10 other people start raising their hand, asking questions about well, what if we're driving? What will happen to our car when we get into these gravity And I'm going, are these people stupid? What the... And then it dawns on me as the lieutenant is going, are they screwing with my head? That this is going on at 30 other barracks. And so the lieutenant turns to the sergeant and goes, and they run out and they get the letter and they go, it's signed by the base commander. I had signed his name. and they go, what could this be? And so he runs back in to call the base commander. At the same time, 30 other people are trying to call the base commander. An hour later, we're standing out there. He comes back that says, the order about the gravity being turned off, that's not really an order, dismissed. Now, the punchline is, for years, I'd be in different Air Force bases around the country, and every once in a while, someone would say, did you ever hear about when they turned off gravity at Keesler? And I was smart enough to say, no, tell me about it. And it always sounded much better when other people told the story. So that was my first large-scale marketing activity. So...
a dangerous man to have in the military.
So I get assigned... other people are getting assigned to Vietnam and Germany. This is after 9 months. I'm in electronic warfare. First place you want to go into, they send you to a war zone. So we're at Germany, Townsend Air Force Base, blank. Homestead Air Force Base, Florida. Florida? Everybody's going, you're going to Florida? And I'm like, wait a minute. I lived in Florida. It was like Homestead was, maybe 20 miles from Miami and Coral Gables. And I get there, and to be honest, I was disappointed. I didn't join the Air Force to sit in Miami. Thanks, but and so here I am in processing in this base, and I hadn't even seen an airplane yet. Seriously, I hadn't seen an airplane yet. And someone walks in and says, hey, we need some volunteers to go to Thailand. Any volunteers? And now, the first rule in the military is you never volunteer for anything. And I believe that's a mistake. My whole life has been about you volunteer for everything. Sometimes you end up with the world's shittiest jobs, but every once in a while you put yourself in a place where no one else wanted to go. And so that's been kind of my heuristic, is you stick out your thumb and see where the world will take you, rather than you sit back, and it depends on how you want to live your life. And the old guys looked at me like, are you out of your mind? People want to come home. And I go, no, So a couple of things. One is they said, perhaps you ought to see an airplane before you go out. And two is, you had to get combat training for, in basic you learned how to shoot, but sometimes these bases were mortared and thought they'd be attacked. So I still remember this. They go out for combat training. It was a 2-day combat course. And we were screwing around. There was like 5 of us going overseas. And finally, halfway through the course, the master sergeant throws down his cap and says, "Son, I sure hope the guy shooting at you was screwing around in his class too." I still remember that conversation. I became, seriously, I got a marksman's badge later on in the Air Force because of that comment, which brought me down to, the game time was kind of over. And life could have depended on it, and never did, but 24 hours later I was in Thailand and spent a year and a half, did 2 tours, 3 Air Force bases, and got and learned something about myself I kind of understood when I got out of the Air Force, but truly understood later in my career, is I found that the 2 things I was actually good at. One was being able to assimilate large amounts of data in a chaotic situation, and 2 is being able to recognize patterns inside those data, probably as faster than most people around me. I got out to the first Air Force base called Karat, and I was assigned to the lowest thing you could do in an electronic warfare base, which was work on the flight line. That's 110 degrees out in Thailand, and lugging boxes in. But when everybody else went home, I started helping the guys who were repairing the equipment, because I was pretty good at that. Even in school, I could understand systems pretty rapidly, and this was new stuff. But very quickly, I wasn't even assigned there. I was working another half shift, and finally, I caught the attention, which was another part of my career. Is someone noticed me? It was, "What are you doing in here?" "Well, I'm just helping, blah blah blah." And after a week of this, the senior master sergeant who was in charge of the shop, and back then that shop had 160 people in it, just in this one piece of or type of electronic equipment, said, "Come here," gave me a pile of broken stuff and said, "Let's see you fix this stuff." And a couple hours later, I did. He said, "Well, you're not on the flight line anymore. You own this shift on the shop." And by a year and a half later, I had 15 people working for me. Quote, working in the military meant managed stuff. But I was that was the first time I had responsibility. Planes wouldn't take off if this stuff didn't work. It was kind of life and death. If it did work, it was supposed to defend the planes from surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft. And I got one day, I was 19, and I finally understood what we were doing when every once in a while I'd be called out to the flight line and to help some people troubleshoot something that worked in the shop and didn't work there. And I noticed all the guys and other crew chiefs from other parts of the base were standing around this empty revetment. The planes were parked, and think of them as parking spots with bunkers around them, and it was empty. Well, why was it empty? Well, the plane didn't come back. And it turned out, and I never understood this till a couple decades later, it was the last plane shot down over Southeast Asia. The pilot never came home. They found his body decades later. And that's when it finally hit me that this wasn't a game, and that not more than a couple hundred miles away, 50,000 people had died with an average age of 21 years old. While I was in a war zone, I was in probably the easiest part of the Vietnam War. And while I was learning a skill, people were, tramping through jungles trying to stay alive. And I think I grew up a lot that day in trying to understand that, other people were the tip of the spear. We were just kind of the spear. So the Air Force was I think a seminal part of my life. As I see my students go through college, I'm kind of jealous about what they get to learn in such a concentrated form. It took me decades to know what they've learned in a couple of years, but I think I got more experience in a shorter period of time in a different part of my life than they ever did. And I see that difference when I see students who are, even today, ex-military. You could tell them a mile away. Different stare, different look, different things are important to them. And when I came home, I had that experience. In fact, I remember absolutely distinctly when I first came to Silicon Valley and started doing startups. One of the comments one of my roommates made to me at the time is, boy, isn't this the most risky thing you could do? What are you thinking about joining these companies? And I had never articulated it before that moment, and I said, I'm confused. I just came from a place where risky meant you could die in what you're doing. It's hard to starve to death in the United States of America. Our version of risk was much different. And I think that gave me an edge in a very different way. And when I made startups my career, is that you couldn't die.
Well, that's great to have that context. Thank you for sharing that really seminal part of your life. Before we jump into your arrival in Silicon Valley, I think there's a little bit of a chapter that we need to talk about in Ann Arbor with your company there. So let's go back. You've come back from Vietnam. You've returned
So I come
to
back and
University of Michigan.
And I actually had a girlfriend who became my wife a little later on, and who was by then finishing up her PhD in Ann Arbor. And I got stationed in a B-52 bomber base in northern Michigan, in a town called Oscoda, and it was 185 miles door to door from Oscoda to Ann Arbor. And so I during the week would wear green and fatigues, and then Friday night sneak out of the base and drive 185 miles and hang out with my girlfriend and my friend Michael Chris, and in a very different world, and be the only one with kind of a crew cut in Ann Arbor in the early 70s. It was actually an interesting experience. And then when I got out, went back to school and thought I wanted to be an electrical engineer, and it was great. I got college work study, I got the GI Bill, and I applied for unemployment insurance. I didn't make as much money for another 5 years. It was truly great. And in University of Michigan, my first job in work study was, believe it or not, the universities in the 1950s through Atoms for Peace all got nuclear reactors. Nuclear power was a big thing, and so there were nuclear power programs in a good number of our research universities. And by the way, it used enriched U-235, weapons grade U-235, that in the 70s they finally realized wasn't a good idea and tried to get it back, which we did, except for Syria and Iran and Iraq. But in any case, the scram system they had from the 50s was a tube-based design, which would scram the system, that is, shut it down anytime there was a thunderstorm. And because you would get stray cosmic rays or gamma rays or whatever, that would trigger the detectors. So they wanted to build a transistorized version. And so my job at the University of Michigan was to build the scram system for the nuclear reactor out of an approved design from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so I did that. But I always had nightmares, whether I wired it incorrectly or not. And I quit that job, actually. You had to wear a film badge and a pocket dosimeter to get your weekly readings from the film badge and the pocket dosimeter, see if you got any dosage. And also to go into the containment dome, there were hand and foot counters. You had to put your hands and feet in. And of course, I worked mostly in the lab outside the dome, and there was ex-Navy nuclear reactor guys who went back to college who were running the reactor. And every week they would print out your radiation results, and mine were always 0, 0, 0. And the Navy guys, when people told me this was not par for the course, but they used to say whoever got the highest dose would buy the beer. And so finally, when my design was done, we tested it a million ways. The NRC checked it, and then they had to install it. And the reactor was a pool reactor. That is, the water was the moderator, and you could actually see the fuel rods. And it was incredibly beautiful because the whole thing would glow unearthly blue because of Cherenkov radiation, which wasn't really radiation. It was I think the electrons exceeding the speed of light in water, and give this great glow. The control room was glowing in red. It was like something, out of science fiction. So they drained the pool, and they were remotely putting my new sensors in around the pool. And there was a little kind of catwalk over the pool. Normally the water was the moderator, but safety was kind of a little loosey then, and so I stood over that catwalk watching them do this as the pool was drained. And a week later, it was my turn to buy the beer. What? I got my annual dose in one day. I hadn't been, and they said, don't do that again. Well, it wasn't I was going to die, but I had just spent 4 years around high-power microwaves with electronic warfare jammers, and now I was getting radiated from, and again, not enough to change my life, but something flipped in my head that said, you know what, seriously, about things that career path, I said, no high-power electronics or nukes for me. I'm going to go into computers. And that really did change a little bit of my career stuff because, you know, nuclear power was a potentially interesting direction back in the 70s, and here I am, like, building some reactor equipment, and thought that was kind of interesting. But then ended up, trying to major in engineering in something a little tamer.
So you made that decision. Do you want to talk about the company that you worked with in Ann Arbor?
So I think I spent half a year as a double E in Michigan, and then realized I still had attention deficit disorder. I really couldn't focus. And in fact, I didn't understand the difference between a design engineer and a technician. And until some professor smacked me on the, verbally on the side of the head and said, son, you want to be a tech. You don't want to be a design engineer. And I finally dawned on me that there was a difference. I had just spent 4 years being a technician, a repairman, not a designer. And I actually enjoyed the repair part because it involved troubleshooting and understanding systems. Okay, and so I dropped out again. So, I like Michigan State and now Michigan probably, have Steve Blank residue. And I got a job in a company called Interactive Systems in Ann Arbor, which was in hindsight, only decades later did I realize it was my first startup. It had been around 7 or 8 years. This is 1976. Maybe probably 1977. It'd been around 8 years, and they were pioneering the use of coax cable to ship data around video coax, and built a pre-Ethernet system to share coax with video and data, and their applications were process control systems for industrial plants, because it was the Midwest, mostly automotive, steel plants, etc. And I was hired as the half of the field service department. It had all of 40 people. And it was truly a startup. I think I was just reading in some of the material I just dug up for this history that they'd done all of $3.5 million of revenue in their 8th year. I had just joined them. But it was the most amazing job, and again, and by accident, in the most amazing time of our country. The Midwest of the United States, is hard to believe now, was the industrial powerhouse of not just the United States, but the world. And because, because we got to install these systems in the middle of automobile plants and steel plants and manufacturing plants, I got to see every one of these plants. I got to fly around and drive around the Midwest, in Oldsmobile and in Lansing and Ford and, the Rouge River plant and U.S. Steel, but when we still had open hearth steel plants. Just amazing seeing, what the country was producing. Watch them make washing machines in Dayton, Ohio. It was on an assembly line. And I would work with mostly blue-collar people and I would spend weeks, sometimes a month at a facility, watching them install the coax, climbing up in the steel, and I didn't like the heights, but I would have a spectrum analyzer strapped to my back, walking on the steel above these factory floors. It turns out how wasteful the U.S. automotive industry was in the early 70s. Every model changeover year, that is, they would change the models of the cars every year, like iPhones did today, they would bulldoze the floor. I mean, literally, they would rip out the entire line. Anything that you needed to keep permanently was above in the steel, like process control and electronics and, whatever, HVAC, but everything else was just like removed. And then they built an entirely new line. It's just amazing, just unbelievable to watch. And so I learned how to be a field service technician. In fact, the first thing they had you do in this little startup is, if you want to be a field service tech, there was this new thing called the computer terminal. And there were portable little ones. Not portable, but like small ones you could have at home. But it was a kit. It was called the ADM3. You guys probably have one of these.
I think
in,
we
in
do.
Your, and so my job was, okay, if you want to be a field service tech, here's the parts, go build your own. So I still remember building my own terminal at home. Yeah, then you had to bring it in.
Bring it into work.
And I remember going to places like Kenosha, Wisconsin for there's an automobile company called AMC. But how I got to Silicon Valley was out of this company, actually. It was February 1978. I was making $14,000 a year as a field service tech. As I said, most of our work was around the Midwest and this great center of manufacturing. And they said, hey, there's a Ford plant in San Jose. Steve, you need to go and help bring up this new system in San Jose. And so they bought me tickets for San Jose, Colombia. Remember, this is hard to believe, before the internet, before Google Maps. I said, I don't think so. I think it's in isn't this in California? No one had ever heard of San Jose. We're in Ann Arbor. No one had ever heard of San Jose. So I remember at lunchtime, our secretary back then had to go out and buy a map of the United States, and I remember all of us gathering around, and there it was. And so she changed the ticket, and I got tickets for San Jose. And so me and another field engineer were going to fly out, and there was a Ford assembly plant in what's now the Great Mall in Milpitas, but it was a Ford assembly plant. We're going to bring up a process control system. We're going to spend a couple weeks, maybe a month or two out here to go do that. Now, just for context, Ann Arbor wasn't some backwater. It was a major research university. Yeah. But around town, if you looked at the local newspaper, and a newspaper for any of your viewers was, we used to kill dead trees and put ink on them, and then that was how we got kind of news. There was something called the Help Wanted ads. And in Ann Arbor, for electronic technicians or engineers, if you were lucky, there were 1 or 2 openings a week, just for context. So we fly out to Silicon Valley. It's a Sunday. We're going to start on Monday in Ford in Milpitas. And back then, the company was so cheap, you had to share a room with, the engineer I was with. And, okay, I liked him. His name was Hussan DeKrub from Dearborn. We get rent a car and turn on the radio. And remember, Ann Arbor, 1 or 2 ads, 1 or 2 lines a week, turn on the radio. And all of a sudden, as we're driving to our motel in Milpitas, we hear, scientists, engineers, Intel is hiring. And we look at each other, and then we look in the back seat. I mean, is someone like, what? And did we hear that? And we changed it. Was that an ad for what? And so it's now Sunday, and we check into this motel, and I always used to like to read Sunday paper wherever I went. And so I buy what was then the San Jose Mercury News Sunday paper. I still remember, right outside the motel, big. And the thing is thicker than the New York Times. And I went, what could be in here? And just as we get into our room, Hussan decides to take a shower first. I turn on the local TV, and I still remember, first section, 5 pages of news. Sports, couple pages. Arts, 45 pages of ads for technicians, engineers, scientists, whatever. It was 1978, Silicon Valley boom time. And I look at this thing, and just as I'm looking at this newspaper, on the TV comes an ad for 4-phase systems. 4-phase is hiring engineering design managers, and I run in, and Hussan is just stepped out of the shower. What's going? I said, you got to see this newspaper. Look. Here's where our lives differ. I looked at this and said, I'm sitting in God's gift to me. And while we went to work that Monday afternoon, I was answering those ads. And Hussan, who had a family, parents he loved, and whatever, said, well, that's nice, but I'm going back to Michigan. And I went, are you out of your mind? Why would, what? And for me, the final kicker was that next weekend. Remember I said we were out there for a couple of weeks. We decided to explore the area, and I always used to like to explore whatever city I was in. Was always kind of interesting. Why sit in a hotel room? We're sitting on a beach in Monterey. It's February. I can't remember February in Michigan. Cold, but here it is. It's 68 degrees. And someone has a radio on next to us. major blizzard is howling through the Midwest. And blizzard through the Midwest? Wait a minute, we're from the Midwest. Monday, we call into work. No one answers. Tuesday, no one answers. We look at the TV. It's one of the biggest blizzards of the last 100 years. I think it was by Wednesday or Thursday, we get somebody to answer back. Remember, pre-internet, pre-phone, iPhone, and whatever. Someone that says, we cross-country skied in and got in through the second-story window. 2 weeks later, when I came back to Michigan, I had gotten a job at a startup called ESL, but driving back on what was called I-94 from Detroit Metro Airport to Ann Arbor, they had bulldozed cars out of the freeway, still sticking out at 10-foot snowbanks at different angles. And I flew back to turn in my resignation and drive across country to my first job in Ann Arbor, in Silicon Valley.
What an incredible turn of events for you.
It gets better.
Good. So you arrive, it's 1978,
February.
right? Start of the boom.
Yeah. So a couple things. So number one is, remember I said I got a job at ESL and whatever? So I had interviewed in a couple of companies, found a couple of recruiters, actually did an interview at 4-Phase and a couple other companies, and all I had was my military background and worked on a nuclear reactor and yeah, I was working in an interesting, but I mean, like I was a low-level tech, and found a training department of all things at a military, in hindsight, a military intelligence company called ESL. And the manager just needed a lab tech for the training department. Not an instructor, just a tech. Sure. And they were going to pay me, remember, I was making $14,000? $40,000 a year. Sure. You know, I had no fun. By then I was divorced from my first wife. I was out here and blah, blah. Sure, let's go. So I drive out from Ann Arbor to California, and I'm supposed to start on Monday at 8 a.m. and time this thing. And except Sunday afternoon, I'm like looking at the map, and I'm stuck in a traffic jam in the middle of the Sierra Nevadas. What? I'm looking at a map. Remember, no nav system, no anything. How could this be? It turns out it was ski week, and I was stuck in Tahoe traffic having no clue. So I show up late, I show up to the HR department, and they go, "Oh, you're Steve Blank. This isn't starting well." Yes. Well, we've been trying to get a hold of you for the last week. Well, I've been in my car driving across country. Well, we're sorry to tell you that there is no job for you. Well, that was my reaction. What? Well, the person who hired you had no authority to do that. What? I have this letter. Oh, we fired him. What?
So now what?
What? And the poor HR woman's looking up my car. I'm living out of my back. I don't know anybody. I said, well, we don't even have an opening for a lab tech. All we have openings for is a training instructor. I said, well, I'm a training instructor. And she looked at me. I said, oh yeah, I taught in the military. I know how to teach, and I'm happy to apply for that job. And she gave me one of these. I still remember. And she said, why don't you talk to the head of the department? And so I remember interviewing with a guy named Roy Van Order, who was the director of training for all of ESL. And in hindsight, and I only understood this in hindsight, they were in deep trouble. They had built this entire military intelligence gathering system for the U.S. Army. It was one of ESL's specialties. And while the system was getting ready, the training material was nowhere to be done. And they had 6 weeks to go to deliver a 10-week training class. And the guy listened to me babble, oh, I could do this. And finally, I think was the deal closer, I said, and I'll take the job at my lab technician salary. And I said, I'm a body sitting in your office. He said, you're hired. And so here I got promoted before I ever even got the job. And my first job in Silicon Valley was as a training instructor, and I had no idea what that meant. And I'll concatenate a long, painful story. But so here I am developing course material. Never developed course material in my life, but I do remember taking courses in the military from what I thought was some of the best vocational training in the world. And I remembered how I like to learn. So I put together a course on how I would like to be taught. Now, this system was 3 40-foot vans full of electronics and 6 aircraft, direction-finding communication intelligence system. And that's when I really realized I could process enormous amounts of data and put together a pretty good course, except
Complex, right?
very complex. Not only complex in terms of system, but complex in terms of some of the technology at the time. Packet switching, compression, etc. And a whole 32-bit computer system and Interdata 832, which is the first time I'd seen and actually had a program and understand the interfaces, and had 6 weeks to do this. But the other part was delivering the material. And I had never stood up in front of anybody. In fact, like I was okay one-on-one, but I was still looking at my shoes, at that point in my life. Making eye contact was like 20 years in my future. So they said, okay, let's see you deliver some of this material as practice. And I still remember that moment. The director of training and my manager, Mike somebody, but Roy Van Arter and Mike were in the audience, and a couple of the other instructors in that group, and I had to present. And I remember standing behind that podium, holding onto it so hard, I still believe there are fingerprints left in a podium somewhere. And about a third of the way through, I see the director of training do this, and walks out of the room. And I, if I didn't wet my pants, it was probably because I was even more scared than that. And finally Mike says, Steve, why don't we stop? I think there's a little more work to be done. And so class starts, and I'm in front of the classroom and holding on to that podium again. And I still remember the first day, one of the students, an Army major who I'm supposedly teaching, took me aside and said, Steve, you tell great stories. You've obviously been on the other side of this classroom. Why don't you pretend you're the student? And you know what? I became a great instructor that day. I dumped the podium. I knew my material. I threw the lesson plan, on the side. I knew what I had to cover, but just started talking like I was in the room, and got the best reviews they've ever had in the instructor. We nailed it.
It was really literally you just flip the switch and you knew instinctively what to do?
I knew exactly what to do. I thought I had to be some kind of professor, which I still don't know how to do. I just knew how I wanted to learn, and started delivering the material like that. And so ended up at ESL, going from a training instructor to kind of a test engineer. Got to go out with the system to deploy to South Korea, and then got invited to work on another project for other customers in the middle of God knows where, Australia, for a year. So I got to go to Korea for a year, got to go to Australia for a year. And it turns out the founder of ESL was a PhD mathematician named Bill Perry. And ESL was probably the most underrated company in Silicon Valley history. It was one of the linchpins that connected Fred Terman of Stanford with Bill Perry and Stanford University. It was part of the secret history of Silicon Valley. It was probably the most important company no one had ever heard of. It was responsible for the first application of computers in military intelligence, probably in the world, if not certainly in the United States. And Bill Perry eventually became the Undersecretary of R&D and responsible for what was called the offset strategy, third offset strategy, where we beat the Soviets in the Cold War with semiconductors, software, and stealth, and then eventually became the Secretary of Defense and built a spectacular company. And so I was kind of fortunate to be in one of the places that was probably as important as Fairchild or Apple in its early days. So that was my first startup in the Valley.
So the role of the military in the Valley has been something that you've taught about in the secret history of the Valley. What other lessons or context did you get from that time, whether from the people that you interacted or this exposure to a lot of confidential developments that you were privy to?
Yeah, well, so one is over time, I realized that that the commercial world and the black world, that is the classified world, the Venn diagram was almost non-existent. The intersection of marketeers and the black world were called spies. That is, you really didn't promote what you were working on. And that also meant that, unfortunately, tech transfer was minimal. We were working on stuff at ESL that the U.S. government could afford to build systems that were unimaginable in the commercial world. I mean, I was working on systems that were building what were called finite impulse response filters, 128 and 256 tap filters, which today you find as chips in a iPhone that were built out of TRW multiplier dividers. In the meantime, between failure, the entire system was about 8 hours. But the military could afford to have tens of thousands of them on racks. So for problems we wanted to solve, these were national efforts, sometimes involving hundreds of thousands of people, spacecraft, things under the sea, etc. And during the Cold War, we built those systems, most of which we still haven't kind of publicly described. The problem is that there was minimal tech transfer and minimum people transfer. Is once you got into the black world in the Valley, you very, very rarely left. So remember, Lockheed went from 0 in 1956 to about 25,000 people in 1960 or 65, maybe peaked at 30,000. And they built not only the overt systems of Polaris and Poseidon and Trident missiles at Lockheed, but they built the first and second generation of intelligence gathering systems, both photo stuff, Corona and whatever, but now declassified all the electronic intelligence stuff. But very few of those people left those programs, because they were just technologically seductive. More advanced technology than anything being done in the commercial world. And once you kind of in the black world, it's kind of not physically hard to leave, but again, mentally hard to leave if you're an engineer wanting to work on the cutting edge stuff. And that's unfortunate. We didn't do that by design, but we kind of hobbled ourselves. Here I was working on the world's most advanced stuff. I mean, truly the world's most advanced stuff at ESL. And I had a roommate who came in and said, "Look, I got this chip to make this speaker go buzz." And I remember that moment going, "You gotta be kidding." And I'm gonna make a company out of it. I think it was my roommate's friends. And most people would laugh hysterically. I'm working on something that has, 100,000 people, not just our company, but other companies. And he made a speaker buzz. But that night I realized I was a cog in a machine that I wouldn't even show up on an org chart. And this person was starting something, and they were going to be master of their own fate. And that was possible here. That wasn't possible anywhere else in the world. And that was the night I started thinking about, I want some of that. And while I was having a great career at ESL, something told me, without a college degree in a company run by a PhD and some of the best research scientists in the world, at best I might end up as a junior program manager, but I was never going to end up having any influence about what got built or how things got whatever. But these things called startups, there were no rules. And No Rules was my middle name. Even by then I was discovering that. And that's when I decided that, as seductive as this was, and I was in the middle, one of the things I was in ESL happened to be one of the most important systems in the Cold War, which I even kind of understood at the time. But I decided to find a different path. And I joined my first commercial startup, which is a microprocessor company.
Before we get into Zilog,
Was that all right? Was that?
That's perfect. I did want to ask you one question of curiosity. I read in a Q&A that you had a notebook that you kept.
Oh, God. Yeah, there are two
Curious about that.
There are two interesting stories about ESL. One very sad, and the other could have been very sad. The one very sad story is I got sent to the site in Australia, which back then was the secret site about a story I'm going to tell. And my replacement was my office mate, a guy named William Farley. And Farley and I were both 20-year-olds, couldn't get a date at the time, would spend Friday nights eating dim sum and running tests and some equipment and out in ESL. And, you know, he replaced me on the secret site, and my life kind of went different. I finally figured out how to partially make eye contact with women and get dates and whatever. But what I didn't realize later, and Farley and I kind of went separate paths and didn't hear much or anything from him after I left. And then one day I'm at my next company, Convergent Technologies, and I get a call from somebody from the Associated Press who I had met at a party. Did you know William Farley? And it was urgent. Yeah. And it didn't click at me at the time. And she said, "Gotta go." What's going on? And that night, trying to drive home to my place in Palo Alto, Highway 101 was closed. So I had to go home another way, and I didn't even turn on the radio. The next morning, I go out to my driveway, and you hear the phrase, someone's knees buckled when they saw something. I picked up the newspaper on the driveway, and there was a picture of Farley, my old roommate, mass murder at ESL. He never did figure out how to talk to women and obsessed over this woman at ESL, and decided that he was going to show her by killing her and other people in the company. Amassed a set of guns, and this was a secure location. Shot his way through the guards, through what we call an airlock, into the building, shot her, didn't kill her, and killed 6 other people. This was my office mate. The problem was they couldn't put him on public trial because he said, if you're going to kill me, if you try to execute me, I'm going to blow out every secret I know. And given what I knew he knew, let alone other stuff he might have known since then, that was not a good thing for the country. He's still on death row in San Quentin. That's my bad ESL story. My funny ESL story is I get to this site in the middle of Australia, the secret site with lots of government customers. And unlike at ESL, where we were a contractor to these folks, this was a customer site. And at ESL, you worked in what was called a vault with controlled safes, and you couldn't take things out and whatever. But here in the site, we're in the middle of nowhere. The safes are kind of open. And I was working for both teaching operations and maintenance. But you get bored, and there were all these manuals for all the systems on the site, not just ours. And there were rows of safes with 3 drawers each, maybe 3 feet long, or and they were literally filled up a wall, but they were always unlocked. So I started reading, and I was discovering really interesting things, and so I kept a notebook of all the things I was reading. And so I would, every time I'd find something new, they all had different classifications, none of which I was cleared for, but they were in the site. So I would add different headings on the notebook. And I would store the notebook back in this unlocked safe. But if you remember, and I didn't understand it at the time, but now I clearly do, I'm pretty good at assimilating large amounts of data and seeing patterns. And so I started making some pretty interesting leaps about the total state of the U.S. intelligence gathering capacity in 1978 worldwide, space, land, and under the ocean. And I have it in one notebook. And about 2/3 of the way through, I get a call from the head of security. "Oh, sure, Steve, you mind if we have coffee?" And so, since we're in the middle of nowhere, I ain't going anywhere, so I guess he wasn't urgent. But next morning, I have coffee. And back then, it's hard to believe now, I had very long hair, almost an afro, and so my hair was long and curly. And a few times in my life, I've been really impressed. He opens up a number 10 envelope, and people used to have desk blotters, taps the envelope on the desk blotter, and 3 long curly hairs come out. And he says, "Do you recognize these?" I said, "Why? They look like my hair." He said, "Yes, that's what we think." He said, "They were found in name of manual, Have you been reading that manual?" "Oh, yeah, you wouldn't believe what I found." And the guy looks at me like, What? "Oh, yeah. Have you been reading anything else?" "Oh, I've been reading all the manuals." His eyes are getting wider. In hindsight, he's thinking, what's going on? And I said, "You wouldn't believe what I discovered. And I've been making all these notes." And when I said notes, his face kind of clenched up. He said, "What do you mean you've been making notes?" I said, "Oh, yeah, I've been making all these notes about all these things that are connected." He said, "Well, what did you do with the notes?" I said, "Oh, I put them in the safe where they belong." He said, what's safe? And I told him where it was. He said, hang on a second. And he ran out, literally, out of his office, came back with my notebook, started reading it, said, I'm not cleared to read this. And then he looked at me and said, you're not cleared to write this. He said, you're not going anywhere, are you? I said, no. He said, okay, let me know if you're planning to leave anyway. So I hear nothing about this other than a week later he says, you know, this site is the most secret site. We're not even cleared to have what you just wrote here. So we had to send it back, and I wasn't even cleared to destroy it. We had to send it back to, place or whatever. So I have a vision of that last scene in the Raiders of the Lost Ark of this notebook sitting in some giant warehouse today, which is so toxic it couldn't be. And I thought I was going to get fired when I came back. And it turns out that what I had put together was actually a great in-process briefing handbook for people coming into this program because it gave them context of how this fit. Except I had to turn down the classification a bit. And so when I got my new job, they hired me to kind of write the write the briefing program for the new people in the system. So that was my notebook story. One other ESL story about that site that was actually quite sad is actually two things. Both of them just kind of messed with my head a bit. One sad and one just strange. There was some guy I knew kind of casually on the site. It was a fairly small site. And his wife got him a birthday gift for something he always wanted to do. We went to Australia, and from New Zealand, they just started the first flights to Antarctica. You wouldn't land there, but there was a DC-10 that would fly you over the glaciers, and it was great and whatever. And so he was excited. And I remember just casually hearing him talk about this. And so he was going to do it that weekend. Doesn't show up on Monday. DC-10 flew right into the glacier. And his wife had killed him. And she wasn't on the plane. And so that stuck with me for a long time about they had to send her home. And you can imagine the rest of her life about thinking that she had sent her husband on a flight that ended so disastrously. And then the other one was I still don't know how to process this, is, our customers at ESL were three-letter agencies for U.S. government. And supposedly you couldn't tell your wife or spouse who you worked for. The story was it was the Joint Defense Space Research Facility. And today it's acknowledged what's one of the agencies are there. And some of the wives actually knew what their husbands, who they worked for, what they did. And if you were married, you got to live off the facility, and I lived on it because I was a bachelor, so you didn't get to live in town. And so the only thing to do was drink and have barbecues at the time. And so one alcohol-fueled barbecue, sitting with a couple of wives, and one of the engineers from ESL had a wife that looked like she was right out of a commune. I mean, granny dresses and granny glasses and, politics to match, and, would always talk about our evil government and whatever. And I'm sitting here going, well, this is a good, interesting conversation. And again, there was too much alcohol at this dinner. And one of the wives said, well, to this other woman, well, if you believe that, what do you think about your husband working for Agency X? And the wife, and all of a sudden you could see the other women go, and the husbands go, and the wife, you could just see, what? And all of a sudden, because she had the reaction of the woman who said this, oh, I shouldn't have said that, it made the woman she said it to go, what?
Yeah.
And she turned to her husband, and then everything exploded. And the next thing I remember was standing outside their house in the grass, looking at the Southern Cross, hearing her scream, "Tell me it's not true." And the next morning, they were all gone. All gone. All three families gone from the site. And I always wondered what happened to him and her. The good thing is ESL was one of the things that probably kept us out of the war in the Cold War, because we were able to understand the intentions of the Soviet Union in a way that stopped us from doing stupid things. So it was actually quite good for the country. But if your worldview was not oriented that way, that everything the government did was evil, that there weren't people with good intentions trying to solve some problems, your world came apart, and her world came apart in exactly that moment. And I remember watching her face as her entire worldview just exploded about the person she was living with, sleeping with, thought she knew, etc., all within like 5 or 10 seconds. And it was just a pretty amazing experience.
Just as we finish this chapter, I wanted to ask, was that with your own direct military service and then your work with ESL, you had this deep involvement with the U.S. military intelligence and everything. Was that easy or hard for you to switch to the commercial world of Silicon Valley and,
Yeah, I think what I said before is that it's incredibly seductive. You know more than most people, and I mean, not that you're smarter, but you know more things going around. Part of the code room at ESL was one of the 5 in the Valley at the time, maybe 4. We would get copies of the president's intelligence brief every day, and I would read it. So I still remember after I left, when I was there, you would read the intelligence brief, and then you would read the New York Times. And you would realize, oh, this is KGB disinformation, this is our disinformation, here are the facts I was reading from. And then after I left ESL, I still remember it was like Superman's X-ray vision fading. I could no longer, I knew that half the news wasn't true. I just couldn't tell anymore which part. And so I'll go back again, is that type of work, if you're a techie, is incredibly seductive. But it was that siren call of being able to be master of your own fate. That was more of a deeper call for me.
We're continuing now with Steve Blank here. We're just finishing the military chapter with ESL and getting ready to start the story of Zilog.
So Zilog was kind of another, you get your nose under the tent and you keep on moving. So I interviewed at Zilog with the manager of training and education. So here I was at ESL, I was training instructor, and great, let's get another job in tech. And I was teaching fairly complicated systems. Remember, I said the military was, and the Department of Defense and intelligence community were building stuff unimaginable on the commercial side. So not that I had anything to do with designing it, but I had to understand this stuff and explain it to other people. By this time, I was a pretty good instructor. By this time, meaning all of like 2 years or whatever, but I was a pretty fast learner, got some great reviews, been working also as a test engineer, taking stuff on site. And again, this startup thing sounded really exciting. And I knew about microprocessors, but never had worked with designing any of them. And I started interviewing around, and it's a company called Zilog, a chip startup, which was started by Federico Fagin, who helped design the, I think, 8008 and 8080 at Intel, got written out of the history by Andy Grove. Started a competitive company, was building something called the Z80, which is essentially a better 8080. And the training department needed another instructor. And so I'm trying to think of who hired me, Canberra or Canberra. But anyway, I get hired by this guy and show up for my job, and shades of my last job, he was fired. There's no manager of the training and education department. This time I have a job, but I don't have a boss.
Talk so about patterns here.
There's kind of like 4 of us in the room, and and whatever. And in this company, in Zilog, training was essentially a sales activity. So it was like helping the Zilog had salespeople, marketing people, more importantly, field application engineers who were training design engineers how to use microprocessors. And remember, people were building their own CPUs back then out of discrete components. And this notion of using a microprocessor and peripheral chips was a whole new idea. So they also had field application engineers who were good design engineers who could help people do that. But there were also some requirements for basic training. what is a microprocessor? How does this work? How would I think about using this? And so that's what the training department was as an arm of sales. And so I get there, and within 6 weeks or 2 months, no one is running this department. And I'm still kind of like a young kid, and I finally go, well, screw it. Like, I can run this department. So I go into the VP of sales. The guy's name was Marty Cohen. And Marty had this great Boston accent, which I won't even attempt to emulate. And Marty goes, what took you so long? I thought it was going to be you. Now, that was really telling, because I really didn't understand it, but obviously he saw something, much like happened later in my career. Is people saw things in me I never saw, and said, okay, go run the department. And basically I had to teach myself microprocessor design and assembly language coding, and ran into something called a word processor called WordStar. I mean, people were building some pretty amazing stuff out of the Zilog microprocessors. We did a training course by mail, how to be a microprocessor design engineer in 10 easy lessons, and it was a mail order course, and held training classes. Because part of the ESL stuff I learned was data communications. I taught our data communications chips as well. There was one called the SIO, and then a very advanced piece of silicon called the SEC. And so I got pretty familiar with that. I got to fly to Brazil and teach microprocessor design. And literally I was probably 20 minutes ahead of the students. I mean, what did I know? I was a tech. But I was living with this stuff, and I was living with the engineers. And our field engineers usually could unscrew up anything I told people to design with wrong. But my favorite Zilog story was, salespeople. We're covering the major accounts, and one of the major accounts, obviously, even in the late 70s, early 80s, was Apple, building the Apple II, and they were working on the Apple III and the Lisa, and the salesman had that account covered. But one day, the salesperson for Apple calls me and said, look, some kid in field service, wants a prototype of our serial communications chip. I'm too busy. Why don't you call on him? He's just down on Bub Road. And Zilog not only was in Cupertino, but it's fab. I still made chips in Silicon Valley at the time. And I used to give tours of the fab. It was actually very, very cool. I drove down to this little kid sitting in this rat's nest of hardware, and he was designing some board, and I showed him how the SEC worked, and gave him some sample designs, and we diagrammed some stuff out. And he was so grateful that they sent an engineer down. Little did he know I was the marketing guy. And by then I had moved into marketing. I'll tell you that story in a second. It was 3 years later, I leave Zilog and see the picture of the Mac team. I had sold the SEC to Burrell Smith.
Burrell Smith, right?
and some salesman from Apple was probably retired in Maui on the commissions, because he never even had a call on the account. And there was no second source for the chip, and Burrell had fallen in love with it. And it was the basis of Apple Talk for the next 5 or 6 years, was that piece of silicon. The other thing I remember sitting in Zilog, I still remember this to this day because they were laughing about it. And it was only decades later that I realized what we had done. Zilog, as I said, made the Z80 and then eventually a 16-bit incompatible chip. Idiocy, but I'll explain that in a second. Back then, the idea of having second sources, that is, other companies that can make your chip, was very important to people who were designing these chips in. What if your company went out of business or something else? And so Zilog would sometimes sell licenses, I think, to AMD. AMD was the big partnership at the time. But then this company from this country called Korea came in. And we were laughing. They wanted a license to the Z80. And we were laughing. Not we, I mean, my boss was laughing, the head of sales and the head of international sales. It was hysterical. They couldn't believe they were going to pay us $5 or $10 million. And I remember the words, what the hell do they think? They're ever going to make silicon? It was Samsung. We were the first company to dump our microprocessor technology to the Koreans. And of course, it's come back to us in spades. I mean, and so, back then it it was an inkling of a pattern we should have understood, but I now remind people, disruption never comes with a memo, right? It doesn't. You could be standing there and looking at it, which I was at that moment, and did not understand we just crossed the Rubicon for a world-changing event. I'll give you another example when I lived that. When I went out to the Ford plant in Milpitas in my first job, I used to love to get a tour of manufacturing lines, and because that machinery of like building cars out of millions of pieces, and this was at the peak of Detroit's arrogance. And I remember going down the line, and there was a spot on the line where they dropped the hoods on the cars, and instead of that car going down to the next line, there was an intermediate step where someone took an army blanket and had a rubber mallet pounding one half of the hood in the other side. And on the other side, he would run with the blanket wrapped around the 2x4 and pry up the other side of the hood. And even I, at the time, understood what's going on. And the plant manager says, they didn't design these things right, and instead of fixing them, they just told us to kind of align them here. What I didn't realize at the time, I was looking at the end of quality at U.S. automobile plants because they didn't care. And that's from that day on, or that decade on, Japanese would eat our lunch because they did care. It was much like watching that moment at Zilog, or later moments at MIPS or Convergent when I was actually standing in a place where something had changed that moment, but disruption never comes with a memo. And that's kind of important.
That's really important. While we're talking about, let's follow that through. What are some other moments where you could see literally this sort of inflection point, which in retrospect, at the time, you couldn't see, no prescience to see what was going to come, but in retrospect, you could see that?
Well, I remember at MIPS Computers, a couple companies on, John Hennessy, Skip Stritter, John Masuris, and we were the entire company, plus or minus some admin support. We're in to see Andy Knowles of Prime. Andy Knowles had been the head of the semiconductor group for DEC, worked for, I think, Gordon, and now moved to be head of engineering or COO of Prime Computer. And we were pitching him the first MIPS R1000, and back then there weren't even slides, there were overheads, and we were putting up, architecture and whatever, and finally the basic benchmark was a VAX back then, which was a digital equipment mini computer, and it was how fast are you to multiples of a VAX, and the slide I made said the MIPS R1000, 10x. And I remember Andy Knowles must have been, 10 years younger than me, but we thought he was an old guy, literally nodding off in the meeting. And obviously he wasn't nodding off, he was just giving us the body language of I don't care, until we put up that slide. And I still remember his head snapped back up and said, son, if you guys could do that, you got a deal. And the entire MIPS risk business started from that one meeting of Knowles going, this is serious stuff, and and Hennessy, Masuris, and Stritter delivered. The other moment, I think, I think was, well, let me put it in context. There's a phrase, and I used it for a name of a company, but it actually is pretty important. It's something called an epiphany. An epiphany is, people have described it for thousands of years, and it's a sudden flash of insight. And people have described this, but no one could replicate it. But it does happen enough that people know it. It is something that happens to human beings. And what I believe it is you're constantly bringing in data, and something in your unconscious snaps together in a pattern that connects with like the talking or thinking part of your brain. I remember in my life I had 3 epiphanies, just 3. Each one of them represented an IPO because they were because the entire future of what was going to happen was laid out in front of me. And one of them was the last company, was Epiphany, when I saw what eventually became the entire CRM industry, which Tom Siebold did a much better job of implementation. But at that moment, we saw something that no one else saw. And my partner Ben Marguerite and I, when this whole lean startup stuff came, I was writing my memoirs in Tahoe. I thought after I retired, the world needed Steve Blank's memoirs, and I started writing, chapters about each, just like these stories, except they would have summaries at the end. And I still remember I was on page 80 My wife and kids were out skiing, and an epiphany just hit me that everything we had been doing was wrong, that we were treating startups like they were smaller versions of large companies. And I had just spent 20 years proving that they weren't, that startups were something very different, and that large companies were executing known business models, and startups were searching for them. And that distinction between search and execution had never been made before. And that the whole lean movement started
amazing.
from that one moment. But it took me, I wasn't going down that path. I was going through actually a catharsis of summarizing a 20-year career. And it was that data dump and just kind of like, boom, a flash of insight. And does that make, I'm not sure that was your question, but
This
those
was
were kind of
exactly
fun.
the question.
Um,
And the third?
I don't remember. I'll
Okay.
try to think about some of the
All
others. But Zilog was a lot of fun.
Just jumping back into Xyla, can you give some context? You started to talk about it, but there were, who else was on the landscape in the technology?
So if you really think about it, Zilog was 20 years into the silicon history of Silicon Valley. Started with Shockley Semiconductor, and then Fairchild, kind of the Trader's 8, et cetera. By the way, the part about computing history that even Gordon Moore, I don't think, understands is that Shockley actually knew something that 20-some-odd-year-olds didn't. And, I never met him and just got to read the biographies. And I think he was a terrible communicator, but he understood something that he was working on this NPNN device, that actually he understood the electronic switch that Bell Labs was trying to build. And what he didn't tell his team was actually the system he had in mind for this device. He just didn't share any of this data. Well, his team actually said, that's nice, but there's a market over here for silicon devices. And of course, Fairchild capitalized on that by just making, transistors, and then inventing Horney and Moore having a race to invent the planar process. By the way, the most interesting part of the Fairchild story that J. Last notebooks talk about was the fact that when they invented the integrated circuit, what do you think the VP of sales at Fairchild said? Any idea? Over my dead body. And I read that and went, what? And it's in fact, that's a pattern that happens in almost every company where the VP of sales is printing money for an existing market. So people were grabbing silicon transistors out of his hand. And so all he had to do was show up with a data sheet and some samples. And so his sales force at Fairchild at the time was an order-taking force. The minute you went to integrated circuits, now you had to do consultative selling. And in fact, this whole sales process required a different sales force and different organization. And in fact, the order process would have been much slower. So from the point of view of the VP of sales of that product line, he was absolutely right. From the point of view about Fairchild as a company, is they blew the IC business, much like every company that invents anti-gravity, like a new technology, is when you invent a new market, the first thing you need to do is get your current VP of sales out of that business and create a new channel with a new division or something else. And that just blew my mind, but it made lots of sense, but we didn't have enough sense to understand that distinction. In fact, today, companies still make that mistake. So for context, Zilog was out of that long history of semiconductor spinouts out of Shockley and then Fairchild. Intel started in '68. Zilog probably started 7 years before, in '75, I think, with Federico and some others leaving. 65 companies came out of Fairchild in 20 years. So the valley was still a semiconductor and defense valley at the time. Almost, and in fact, no commercial systems. There were no personal computers in the late 70s. Apple had just gotten started that year or the year before, I believe. And no electronic design automation tools. I still remember a peripheral chip called the CTC being laid out on a big table in front of us with rubelith and people cutting them, the rubelith with like X-Acto knives,
hand.
thinking that that's how you do design. And then reading about, some company called GE was thinking about some division, some electronic design stuff. I mean, it was basically, and in fact, it was Ross Freeman who built the SIO and SEC, who went off to, I think, co-found Altera. And my job at Zilog had gone from the training department and into my first marketing job. And I got the marketing job because here I was teaching microprocessor design with all our peripherals, and I had an opening in marketing. And the first thing is, I didn't know what marketing did. I mean, I understood what engineering did because I was hanging out with them, and I understood what sales did because I was like in the sales department. And the fab, I would give tours of the fab, so that was manufacturing. But what was the marketing stuff? What did they do? And given Zilog's history, it wasn't clear they actually knew what their role was, but they had an opening. And their opening was what you would expect is MBA required, 5 to 10 years of experience and blah, blah, blah. And of course, I had none of that, so I applied for the job. And I still remember the classic conversations. What makes you think you're qualified for this job? Well, I know every one of our customers, and I could teach design with our stuff. And it was a pretty compelling argument. So they allowed me to become a junior product marketeer, and I was responsible for all the Z8000, the 16-bit line peripherals. So the SEC, the FIO, some other DMA chips and whatever, and learned the difference between a feature and a benefit and whatever. But Intel had Bill Davidow. And Bill Davidow was probably one of the best technical marketeers at the time. You got to remember in the 60s and 70s, no MBA worth their salt would go to work for Silicon Valley. It was technologist. And so technical people actually needed to teach themselves how to be marketeers because it was a pretty esoteric business. And remember, you were selling business to business. There was no consumer marketing going on. And Davidow came out of that background, and he was really effective. He did something called the Crush campaign, which Crush campaign was how to sell Intel's 8086 against the 68000 and the Z8000, which were all competitive 16-bit microprocessors. Probably the 68000, if I remember, was probably the better architecture, and then a toss-up between how screwed up the 8086 and Z8000 was. Z8000 might have had a better architecture, but again, this was a lack of strategy in the company, is that the design engineers decided to build the Z8000 as a clean sheet of paper, completely uncode compatible with the existing Z80 base, which meant that any customers that had designed in Z80, well, it was an even choice of whose processor you pick because there was no code I could use. Instead of making it, a superset of it was just, again, it was technologist rather than somebody with some business sense. And again, it would have been hard to kind of get Shimiya and the other architects to kind of understand that distinction. I have to tell you one funny story about Zilog is, I mentioned Marty Cohn was from Boston, the head of systems division. Rolando Lastravina was Argentinian. Manny Fernandez was Cuban. And I forget, Federico was Italian. And so I was invited into one board meeting to kind of talk about something in training, which I never knew what a board meeting was and whatever. But I came into that board meeting, I'm sitting on the side of the room for the first 10 minutes, and I started to panic because all of them were speaking, I think, English, but I couldn't understand a word because it sounded like the United Nations without translation, and they all understood each other, and it took me about 10 minutes to finally get in sync with the accents, but I still remember that moment where, are they speaking in English? What the hell are they saying? It's actually quite funny. By the way, Zilog, the year I was there, had Eric Schmidt, Judy Estrin, Bill Carrico. I mean, just in a number of amazing people through that place. It was probably the best engineered and worst business strategy company I've ever worked in, well, other than the ones I did. It was just a underutilized set of resources.
Do you want to say more about that? Actually, was going to be my next question about those key people that you were bumping up against and you're working with. Yeah. Again, you walk into this company with one role, shift to another, but an amazing set of people. Do you want to say more about?
Yeah, Judy Estrin was it's very funny. I should just do this as a sidebar, and I don't mean to be patronizing, but for some reason, I've always been attracted to smart, powerful, and aggressive women, probably in that order, with just brain power. I tend to marry them, and I tend to like working with them. In fact, what I found out later is that, remember the manager who hired me at Zilog who disappeared? Turned out it was Adele Goldberg's husband. And I got to know Adele at my next company, Convergent. And I was a big fan of Adele, a big fan of Judy Estrin. Later on in my career, one of my mentors was one of the first women VCs, Catherine Gould. And Catherine was a huge influence in my life for a couple decades, actually, and she passed on way too early. She was a recruiter, but then one of my board members, then just a friend for the next 15 years or so. In fact, I remember a great Catherine thing I didn't understand at the time and clearly understand now, is I asked her, why don't you, they keep offering you all these awards for, best woman VC in the Valley. She said, Steve, that's bullshit. I don't want to be known as the best woman VC. I want to be known as the best VC.
Yeah.
And nowadays we go, well,
Here,
duh.
here, yes.
But it wasn't, that wasn't clear. It's like, and she just operated, and most of these, well, the other one, Donna Dubinsky, who's we still see as a friend. All of those were smart, aggressive, extremely competent women who were operating in a guy's world, and they had to be better than the guys and just operate. Karen Richardson, our VP of Sales, eventually became the CEO of Epiphany. All had those characteristics of, not just good but great, and with a great user interface as well. So anyway, so Judy was there. Her soon-to-be husband, Bill Carrico. I vaguely remember Eric there. Our lives would cross again later on. And Ross Freeman, again, who I think started, I think it was Altera. Lots of other startups came from that one company. And again, it was lack of context. I don't think they understood, the role of the transition of code compatibility. Certainly didn't from 8 to 16-bit, or wouldn't have made that mistake. They didn't understand how that marketing wasn't sales support, which is why marketing worked, for sales, I think, at the time. Yes, marketing has to make sales the richest people in the company, but if it wasn't doing strategy, then it was just sales support and got steamrollered by, again, David L. at Intel, who was spectacular. Zilog for a while was also in the memory business, and why are we, same thing like Intel is why are we in this business when the Japanese have commoditized that business? Why do we have fabs in Silicon Valley, and they had set up a fab in Nampa in Idaho? So these things are required, in hindsight, chess moves, and this was a company that was playing checkers for business strategy while they had world-class chess players on the technology.
I want to just, that's such a great summary of sort of what happened to Zilog, what the possibilities were in terms of the technology.
Oh,
and
there's another thing I should mention about
good.
that, which was way above my pay grade at the time. Zilog's investments, which I only found out later, that is, investors, were Exxon. So Exxon in the late 70s was trying to build a portfolio of technology because one of the first oil crises happened then, and they said, oh, maybe we should get into some other businesses. So they put together a conglomerate internally called Exxon Office Systems. So they had Quix and Quip and Zilog. I don't know if in the history you've gone through that. So I'm sure on the highest level, Manny and Federico were being pressured by Exxon to fit into some strategy. So I'm sure if you interview them, it's really interesting to hear their strategy. That's not the business strategy I'm talking about. I'm talking about the technical product roadmap, which to me, the biggest failure in hindsight was the next chip after the Z80 should have been what they did 20 years later, which was the Z800.
The 800, right?
Which, let's take all the code we have, and now you can run it in a 16-bit space, rather than reinventing the whole world about see how smart we are in building the best architecture, which, given unconstrained engineering, that's what you get. And that's always a trade-off between let's invent the future with, gee, can we leverage our past? And that's hard because, again, it doesn't come with a memo. But Intel got it right. The 8086, 286, and whatever, for whatever architectural things that wanted to make you gag, you could ostensibly reuse the code, right? You didn't have to learn completely new architectures. Zilog shot themselves in not the foot, in the head with that.
Let's talk about your role in marketing. It was an unusual time that people didn't understand really the technology. As you're saying, you're really customizing and working with customers in new ways. And there were people, Bill Davidow, Regis McKenna, all these people who were kind of framing in new ways what the technologies were and how to use it. Do you want to talk? You brought with you today about some of the materials and your, what was your approach? What were your techniques, your tactics, and what do you think you contributed in terms of, in your role as marketing?
At Zilog?
Yes.
I think at
And what did you learn from that too?
Well, at Zilog, I was, not only not having an MBA, but not even having a college degree, as I said. I didn't even know what marketing was. Somebody had to explain to me the difference between a feature and a benefit. I didn't know what a data sheet was. I mean, so I think my contribution was not making a fool of myself and being able to describe the products so that the engineers didn't throw up. But somehow I established a pretty good working relationship with engineering. And again, because I had been teaching design of this stuff, understood enough about how these components were actually used. So I wasn't some MBA coming in thinking I knew how to market. I actually knew both ends of customer needs. Implicitly, I wouldn't have articulated that way. And what engineering intent was for the parts. And so was able to kind of figure out how to describe this stuff. But today we would call it product market fit. Back then, that wasn't even a concept. And internally, Zilog had a head of marketing communications, Bill somebody, but it had a great PR agency, Janice Yulovich and Bill Orange, Janice and Bill were probably, again, some of the, world-class folks. Just the two of them, never built on purpose an agency the scale of Regis or anybody else, but they were really efficient. But I think the company was limited, and so was I, that there really were no senior marketeers who understood what marketing was. It took me much later in my career, I think, 2 more companies to understand, at least for me in a technology company, marketing's job is number one, to create end user demand and drive it into a sales channel. That's number one. What I used to tell my people later in my career is marketing's job is to make the VP of sales the richest person in the company. And if you're not doing that, then everything else doesn't matter. Then number 2 is educate the channel why our product is better, faster, etc. And number 3, help engineering understand customer needs, desires, futures, etc. And so you had tactical roles, communication roles, but you also had strategic roles with engineering. And most places either became Marcom, marketing was really Marcom. Well, okay, that's PR and fancy data sheets, and maybe we go to trade shows. Or other places it was sales support. But ultimately, it's all 3 of those things. It needs to be both tactical and strategic. And in a startup, you need to help engineers discover what product market fit was, or else you ended up just letting them free run and building things that no one cared about. That was much further in my future, but I was getting a really good education at Zilog and understanding that. And then I wanted to move into, Zilog had started to move into the systems business. And this was a great startup mistake. We made it again at Convergent and saw lots of companies making it, is confusing technology with a business. As Zilog said, hey, we got these now 16-bit processors, and there's this standard operating system called Unix, and we're building development systems, that is, systems that allowed engineers to emulate other systems. So we were building kind of computers. Why don't we get into the computer business and sell computers? And so Zilog started a computer systems business where Judy Estrin and Bill Kerrigan, in fact, Bill ran that division. And I wanted to move into that division. And because of classic company politics, I didn't get the job and decided to leave and join a systems company. But it would be a mistake I would see other people make, is that, well, gee, you're going to sell a couple of boxes because you have a computer and an operating system, but people don't buy boxes because you built them. People buy boxes to solve problems. So what problems are you solving, and for who, and what are the applications and ecosystem that needs to be way past what most people were thinking? Hey, we're hardware people or software people. Let's build the boxes, and we're now in the computer business. And again, it was a long time before people understood the power of applications and ecosystems and software developers, etc. Zilog made that mistake as well and got themselves into a business they knew nothing about. And I don't mean didn't build good systems, but understanding how to sell computers and what actually was a pull rather than a push a box or two was completely different.
So help us kind of see the evolution of Zilog, its growth, its end game, and then what led you to move on to
So when I was there, Zilog had started with a Z80. I was there and they made, just for context, the Z80, when I got there, I think Z80A was 2.5 megahertz. There was a Z80B at 4 megahertz. Z80C, I think, was 6 megahertz. They were hundreds of bucks. And in fact, how shoddy the business practices were at the time, I think we had a Z80B where it's coming out. We couldn't make enough of it, and the yield at the fab was terrible or whatever, and we had customers clamoring for them. So the VP of sales, I still remember being in this meeting, told the head of fab or whatever, ship them like failed units. Ship them. well, they'll plug them in and they'll smoke. It's okay. Then we'll have another 2 weeks to work the problem. So they shipped bad parts knowingly, so they were making Z80s. And I came just about the launch of shipping of the Z8000. They were also making a chip called the Z8, which was a microcontroller, kind of a lots of I/O. After that, Zilog, never scaled past, I think, its early potential. Judy left, Carrico left, Federico left. Manny went on to run DataQuest. Federico had a great career doing some other vision stuff and some other stuff. Eric Schmidt, of course, went back to Berkeley and then had a great career at Sun and then Novell and then obviously Google. And I kind of lost sight of the company. I think it's still around. Isn't it still around?
I think this it got acquired, right, by TPG, and then went through turnaround, and it's sort of had this.
Yeah, I think the 70s installed base is probably still
there.
And then I read decades later they finally did build a Z800, which they should have
decades later.
later.
Yeah. When did you decide that you were ready for your next step?
Well, I think the company let me know I was ready when I didn't get the job in the systems business and was interested in computer systems rather than components. I thought the components were great and learned a lot, learned how to design microprocessors. But this idea of an operating system, this thing called Unix, was really an operating system. What's that? And software. And I had gone back to night school. I was taking De Anza College at the time, had some great instructors from Hewlett-Packard who were building the HP 3000, and so took what was, I think the operating system was MPE, and took an MPE operating system design class, a couple other systems classes at night, and really got into systems. I was always trying to learn new things, and thought that some systems company would be interesting, and got either recruited or somehow ended up at a company called Convergent Technologies. And my interview at Convergent would shape my career for the next 20 years.
Place us in the year. This is early 80s?
It must have been 82, 83,
mm-hmm.
maybe, 81. Convergent was, now we would call it a PC company, personal computer company, but there was no standard operating systems. But they were building desktop personal computers when that was like completely unknown with a custom operating system. Alan Michaels, who was co-founder, was a marketeer from DEC, went to Intel, ran their development systems group, was insane, just a crazy man, but incredibly charismatic. Must have been an old guy at the time, in his mid-40s, or early 40s, and then partnered with Ben Wegbright, who was the computer science professor at Harvard, ran half of the advanced systems division at Xerox PARC. Bob Garrow, who was invented something called the multibus, and then another co-founder and someone named Cal Eubler, who had worked with Alan, I think, at DEC as a salesman. So this was kind of a DEC and Intel crew. Jay Spitzin and some other great architects were there. So I was probably employee, I don't know, 50 or 80 at Convergent. But I remember the interview. I interviewed with a bunch of people, including my ostensible boss, a very smart woman named Pauline Alker, who later on would be a great role model because everything she did, I would, in my career, made sure I did the opposite. And I don't mean there was much malice involved, but Pauline had a tough role of being Asian, a woman, in truly a guy's company out of deck culture, and so she was dealing with lots of stuff at the time. But I remember interviewing with her boss, who at the time, Ben had moved from head of engineering to, believe it or not, head of sales and marketing. And I remember the interview from Ben like it was, yesterday. Back then there were printed resumes, there were no software, and so my resume had my career to the time. It was a little interesting, Air Force and nuclear reactors and broadband coax and finite impulse response. It was pretty interesting, microprocessor design. Except for education, it just said Mensa. No, it wasn't blank, it said Mensa. Mensa back then was some IQ,
Sure.
whatever. I had to put something down, so I remember Ben looking at this resume going, in a deep Ben voice, "This is the strangest resume I've ever seen. You have no education." I said, "Yes." I said, "What does that mean?" "Well, I've never graduated." Which all of a sudden, Ben's this, I won't say snob, but he did teach computer science at Harvard. I mean, Ben was like a genius, and would be for my next 20 years as both, a boss, a peer, and a co-founder together. So I'm like a huge fan and a big influence. But I still remember, and Ben is a little, well, why'd you put that down? I said, well, I thought it would get your attention. Obviously it did. And Ben never cracked a smile, but you could just see. And of course, nowadays this is typical, but it never happened to me until then. He said, well, describe, like this broadband coax. I started talking. He said, no, up at the whiteboard. Up at the whiteboard? Okay. Well, I had just gotten done teaching. So I taught Ben as much as I remembered about broadband coax. This is pre-internet, and DataPoint and Convergent were building the first local area networks for data, also pre-internet. And I had sold the SEC chip, so I could do a pretty good job. And then he said, well, tell me about ESL. And I had to be careful about the applications, but I could talk about data communications links and finite impulse response filters and whatever, and blah, blah, blah. And it was like doing your orals in hindsight. And,
How long did that take?
Seemed like forever.
Minutes or?
Seemed like forever. Probably, I don't know, 40 minutes. And
Long
Ben
time.
didn't say a word. Just, tell me more. Tell me more. Oh my God. And, especially for ESL, and he'd say something like, well, where were these signals coming from? And you couldn't say, I can't tell you. So anyway, that's it. He doesn't say anything. He said, thank you. I leave and call the recruiter, or a day later, the recruiter goes, your ostensible boss didn't want to hire you at all. But Ben Regbright thought, you were amazing. I went, well, this isn't going to be good, but they offered you a job. I took it in a second. And Pauline and I always had a tenuous relationship. Well, I didn't understand, as I said. It took me a decade or two to understand the pressure she was under from working directly from a crazy person, which I would not know until the next company when I reported to Alan Michaels, who was truly insane. But I got the job. I was in head of product marketing for this startup called, or now early stage company called Convergent Technologies, who were building what I would say were OEM workstations for other companies. There's companies that were now transitioning into desktop computers who hadn't mastered the art of microprocessor design. That is, they had been mini computer companies, so Prime was a customer, Burroughs was a customer, NCR was a customer, TRW was a customer, all wanting to build these things, but their engineering groups hadn't figured this out. And that was probably my first real education on serious sales and, more importantly, serious marketing. That's when I think I learned at the feet of masters. And I can go through a series of things I learned there, which were incredibly important. Should I?
Let's do that. This is a perfect time.
So probably to me, one of my role models at the time, and we'll talk about Alan Michaels in a second and Ben, but it was a guy named Rob Van Arden, who was VP of Sales. Rob had been a design engineer at DEC. In fact, he slept in Gordon Bell's living room when he was designing the PDP-6, I guess, and was an early engineer at DEC, and Alan took him from DEC into Convergent. But Rob turned out to be a great sales guy because he understood the tech, but he had this wonderful personality, and I'll give you an example. Here we are, I think it was Burroughs we're going into, somewhere in Pennsylvania, or wherever Burroughs was at the time, who was a computer manufacturer, one of the bunch, one of the 6 competitors to IBM, made minis and mainframes. And Rob is reading the local newspaper in wherever we are in Pennsylvania. And I knew Rob wasn't a sports fan, but he's reading the sports section. And I noticed that. I didn't say anything. And we go in, and I'm there because I'm the guy from the factory. And what you find out later on in your career is that the salespeople could be the smartest people on the planet, but a customer never wants to hear it from the salesperson. They have to hear the same exact thing from someone from the factory before they'll believe what the salesperson. So I was kind of repeat what Rob said, because this guy knew everything I knew. But I was, by then, pretty articulate and could, explain much like Alan, maybe a junior Alan, about explaining how wonderful our stuff was and whatever. And so this is kind of my first set of meetings ever outside the building. And, the meeting's about to start, and I want to jump up and present, and Rob kicks me. And he said so at breakfast. He said, "Follow my lead." But I was ignoring that, wanted to start, and kicks me. And Rob's first words out of his mouth, I still remember this 40 years later. He says, "How about them name a local sports team?" Go, how about them sports team? What the hell are we talking about sports team? And all of a sudden the room breaks into, how about them? Yeah, whatever, what a game. And Rob's going, did you see what so-and-so? How the hell did he was reading that at breakfast? Okay, now can we talk about our product? And Rob turns to the senior head of engineering in the room. Remember, we're trying to sell computers to other computer companies who couldn't keep up with the technology. So they're already defensive. We're in their room at all. And Rob goes, "So how's your wife? I heard she was ill." What? Why are we talking about whatever? Oh, yeah, now the conversation. Well, Rob was building a rapport with people in the room where I just wanted to talk bits and bytes. And then he says something that I wanted to throw up. He says, "Look, I don't know why we're here. You guys could build better computers than we could in your sleep. If you had the same $40 million we raised, or whatever the number was, you could do this as well. But since, why don't we just say we had the meeting and we could leave. You don't need to see our slides." And goes on like that. Yeah, everybody agrees. Yeah, we were here when the cavemen were making transistors out of rocks and whatever. And I'm rolling my eyes. And Rob is building rapport by lowering the resistance in the room so people would listen. And it took me, I won't go through finally I got to speak, but it took me years to kind of emulate this practice about, maybe he was empathetic, but he was certainly emulating empathy. And now later on in my career, I used to teach my marketeers an explicit class on how to emulate empathy. I literally would give them this as a script, who were very smart technical people who did not have that DNA of look people in the eye, kind of try to make some connection and whatever by lowering that resistance. So that was a Van Arden thing. Michaels really had some of the best marketing instincts in the business at the time. Convergent went from 0 to $400 million in 4 or 5 years, IPO. But he was as politely as I could say, a no-rules marketeer, a terror to his board, selling stock when he shouldn't have sold, all kinds of stuff. But we sold computers to, people who shouldn't have, been buying them. They should have been building them. There's another lesson I learned. The VP of sales at the time was a guy named Dick Meese. And Dick was an old sales guy from Honeywell, after Rob. Meese taught me an important lesson as a marketeer. By this time, I had moved into the Unix division, which was building a multiprocessor system called the Megaframe. And I had put together what I thought was the world's best data sheet. It had 16 pages. It described every possible question you ever wanted to know about this computer. Now remember, this computer was not being sold retail. It was sold to other computer manufacturers, and so there was always a salesman involved. But this data sheet was so perfect, I was about to learn a very expensive lesson. I get a call, we're now in separate buildings, I get a call from Alan Michaels, the president, that said, Steve, can you come over to the main headquarters? Sure. Anything or no, just come on over and want to chat with you and Dick. So I drive over and pull over. It was at 2500 Augustine Drive in Santa Clara. And as I pull in the parking lot, I notice people are having some kind of cookout outside in the parking lot. And this is kind of unusual because it didn't look like marshmallows or anything. There was just black smoke coming up. And I go into Alan's office, and he said, look out the window. And I look out, and there's that people having some kind of barbecue. Except they're not cooking food. They're throwing things, paper, out of boxes. He said, those are your data sheets. I went, what? I just printed up 10,000 of them. And Dick is just smiling, and Alan is smiling. I said, it was perfect. It was like engineers said it was, because I always learned you check with engineering and you translate their needs into what customers want. He said, Steve, we pay our salespeople a lot of money. What do you think their job is? I said, to sell the system. He said, well, it's actually to convince people, who don't want our stuff about why they should buy it. You've made the world's most perfect data sheet is that after they get this, they have no more questions. So they don't need our salespeople. He said, that's a real mistake. And so what you really need to do is get their interest, but allow our people to actually, figure out what objections they were and use the rest of the questions as an entree into the company. And so literally my data sheets, and so I got it down to a 4-page data sheet or later on. But it was a very interesting and expensive, and Alan was a classic theatrical marketeer. He used to spray paint things on the walls. I mean, it was just gave people spot bonuses at $20,000. I mean, when $20,000 was a lot of money. Just an amazing marketeer. But again, no bounds on his behavior. Truly a dysfunctional CEO, but for a while incredibly successful. And I would join his next startup and learn a ton of stuff about what he got right at Convergent and actually got wrong the second time around.
Let's put a marker on that to come back to that while we finish the kind of Convergent story. What should we talk about next for Convergent?
So there's a Convergent story that I don't tell often, and it's lost the time, and we'll still debate whether it's apocryphal or actually true, because this one, I, if you remember, had always this kind of mischievous side of running pranks. There's another prank I had pulled in the Air Force, by the way, is when I was in Thailand, I got bored again on night shift I used to run, and had access to the administrative offices. And I thought it would just be great because I'm sitting around, I could read everybody's personnel records and whatever. Why don't I just create a fake personnel record for somebody? And so back then there was like a Cheech and Chong album. Cheech and Chong was a comedy routine, and they were kind of counterculture comedians. And they made up a character called Ashley P. Roachcliffe. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to have an airman named Ashley P. Roachcliffe? And so spent 3 months making up a fake personnel record for Ashley P. for no other reason other than I was just trying to amuse myself.
3 months?
Yeah,
this is an elaborate prank.
Yeah, I mean, I got medical records, I got training records, because every night I'd have about, a half hour. And I mean, literally, he was such a bad airman. I mean, it was like, court-martialed. He was like, but I had to get the paperwork from different parts of the, so I'd sneak it out from friends in different parts of and so I would just put it back in the file cabinet. Didn't think anything of it other than it was an intellectual, puzzle. Can I make up? So anyway, I forget about this thing, and about a month later, I'm on working night shift, which I used to love, from midnight to 8 a.m. Because no one would hassle me. I got my own group of guys. It was a 24/7 shift in the middle of the war, and you would do handoffs and people giving you equipment and then you handing it off to the next guys. but I'd always sneak out before management would show up, which were the officers and whatever. And then one day I heard there's an all hands, all shifts meeting at 0900, which meant at 9 a.m. And by the way, you all got to stand outside your building. What's going on? I get out of the building, and not only is our shop there, but every other shop in the avionics squad is lined up around the flight line, and there's the deputy base commander with a pile of records in front of him. And they announced in a loud voice, and our shop was about 160 people, and there were maybe 5 or 6 other shops, maybe not as big, but like 500 or 600 people lined up. You're here, and he was not happy because it's going to get hot. We're here because U.S. Air Force Command Pacific says we're supposed to have 327,912 people in the Pacific Command, and we have 327,913 being reported. And I went, what? And I realized that somehow Ashley P. Roachcroft got added. And they said, we've traced the discrepancy down to this avionics squadron. When I call your name, come up and pick up your record. And they go through all the other shops, and then they get to the electronic warfare shop. You know, Airman Aardvark, yes, march up. Airman Blank, yes, I'm up. And they go through 120 people until they go, Airman Roachclip. And the minute they say that, a couple other young airmen start snickering because they've heard the Cheech and Chong album. And like, I'm like moving to the back row going, holy shit, I'm going to go to jail. They're going to send me to Vietnam. Oh, I am in a war zone. Where else can they send me? And I'm thinking, jail? I mean, what could happen to me? You know, and unlike the gravity thing, this wasn't even on purpose. I wasn't trying. And so now they call out again, Airman Roachclip. And all of us, and the base commander is getting pissed. And all the other airmen start laughing hysterically. And right out of the movies, the deputy base commander puts his face right next to, I mean, it's getting hot. It's been 3 hours. Hundreds of names been called. To the first guy who laughed and said, son, what's so funny? And just like out of the movies, the poor airman goes, sir, Ashley P. Roachclip is a mythical cartoon character, sir. I have the record in our dorm. Would you like to hear it, sir? And the guy goes, what? And then a couple other people jump in. Yes, it's really funny. Would you hear it? And he's like trying to process, like, what? And he's looking through the record going, no, wait a minute. This can't be. And like all of a sudden, there's this buzz at the desk. And I'm going, I'm going to be dead. I'm going to be really dead. 10 minutes of buzzing, and they decide they found the faker. And you mean there's no Ashley? Dismissed. And I go, they're calling in, the investigative group and whatever. 6 days later, the air war over Vietnam ends. And they dismantle the base. And like, nothing ever happened. But that was the last large-scale prank I did until I had the moon rock at Rocket Science Games 30 years later. So anyway, I'm sorry about the digression, but
that is too good a story.
Yeah, that was
to not
a good.
miss.
That was so.
We'll make
Ashley
note.
Roachclip.
Yeah, we'll make note about the moon rock.
All right. So sorry, where were we? Convergent.
Convergent.
Yeah,
We
sorry,
were
is
just
this exhausting?
finishing up on. I want to make. Well, you were starting to talk.
So Convergent was a real. And for context, though, Convergent was really a transitional company that again missed the strategy. And I remember being there when it happened, getting yelled at about it. Not that I was prescient, but this is before DOS, right? So they had built a world-class operating system called CTOS, real-time, like 10x better than DOS. They built a networking system pre-Novell that had, was essentially client-server. It was 10x more robust than Novell. But much like DataPoint, which was a kind of competitive company at the same time, both Convergent and DataPoint, excuse the pun, missed the point. They built closed systems. It's a big idea. They built closed systems. They didn't understand, and what's ironic is they were both OEMing systems, but didn't understand they should probably have been OEMing subsystems at the same time. If they would have opened their operating system and built external APIs, right? Or if they would have opened their networking architecture They had
Yeah,
something,
it's a huge platform.
huge platforms, but this concept really was just foreign. Is no, we're selling systems, we're making a lot of money, we're doing great and whatever. And again, it's not that anybody was stupid. It's this, you see these patterns in hindsight. The other thing that went on was when DOS came out, we were running a proprietary system, CTOS, and I remember putting out a memo. We were already a public company, to Alan and a couple of other execs saying we need to be running dual operating systems, CTOS and DOS. And because I had, again, always had a good relationship with engineering, I had this small little internal group going on, not a development group, but a lunch group saying how hard would it be to port DOS. And as an experiment, someone had ported one of the kernels and said we could do this in like, a couple weeks. So I wrote this memo to Alan that said, Alan Michaels, the CEO, that we're going to miss a huge opportunity. And because we were a public company, and Alan was like, Alan, he made me pick up every copy of those memos and destroy them. And in hindsight, I should have insisted, but what did I know? I was like a junior, well, not a junior marketeer, but I just thought we made a mistake. And in hindsight, we made a huge mistake. But again, we were among everybody else who didn't understand the power of an open system architecture, as crappy as it was. And Gates was a brilliant marketeer who had made
That
the right.
would come later, right?
Right, much later. So that was conversion.
Two quick questions on this. One was consultative selling, marketing. If you want to say a little bit more about, is this the time that this sort of crystallized for you, or?
Yeah, watching watching Rob, Dick Meese, Jack Kay, who would all go off to spectacular careers as CEOs of their own, both understanding, they were all from deep technical backgrounds, at least Jack and Rob were, understand how to understand customer needs, at the same time understanding the political needs of engineers who were always start the meetings sitting with their arms crossed and like, why are you in my building? I hate you already. To getting a conversation going of maybe we could help you was something I learned when I moved into MIPS later. To be able to deeply understand not only their problem, but remember you're OEMing, so you had to understand their customer's problem. That's the biggest problem in selling through through a proxy of someone else. If you didn't understand their customers as well or better than they did, you usually ended up in a problem. And so this company was really good at that. Michael's instincts were impeccable, and he built a sales force that was impeccable. Marketing was okay. That was me and some others, and Pauline and others. But really, in this company, our salespeople actually were the winners here. And engineering. Garrow and Ben built a spectacular set of early desktop. And someone named John Huey and Jay Spitzen were some of the early, and Greg Walsh, who we did a couple companies with, were spectacular software engineers and hardware. Rich Lowenthal. It was a great set of hardware and software engineers, way past whatever would happen in Microsoft and Novell and other places for at least a decade. But again, because the business strategy optimized what I call a local maximum rather than a global maximum. That is, they $0 to $400 million back then was real money. I mean, but they didn't build a lasting company because they didn't understand it was actually the subsystems that, if unbundled, would have been even more powerful. And you could have done both. You could have had this OEM business and then decided that we're actually going to open up the architecture. We could, hindsight is great, and in hindsight, that's what we probably should have done.
Hindsight, often 2020. Ben, you mentioned that Ben was an important person for you there, and then played these different roles: mentor, collaborator, co-founder. Do you want to talk about Ben now?
I should go through. One of the things I learned as an entrepreneur, and I remind my students, if you're lucky, you're going to end up having, there are people you take classes from, there are people who could be coaches, but to have mentors in your career are make and break things. And at least when in the 20th century, guys didn't say they were being mentored. That was like too touchy-feely. Guys were guys, and people smoked cigarettes and drank and whatever. But I had a couple mentors in my career that just changed my trajectory. Some of them were overt, some of them were covert. Some were anti-mentors, as you saw everything they did and said, I'm not going to do that. And like the sins of the fathers on the sons, you sometimes ended up doing the same behavior. Alan Michaels was an implicit mentor that I swore I was never going to have that behavior and ended up doing that. Pauline, the same thing, not a world's most perfect boss, but incredibly smart and, whatever. But for selling, it was Rob Van Arden. For like just intellectual horsepower in my career, it was Ben. And I could never have done what I did without Ben. Another mentor in my life we'll talk about later, who I met at MIPS, was Gordon Bell, who and Gordon and Ben, and probably Rob and Catherine Gould, all have this funny thing of, I didn't get it at the time, spend time with me that I didn't understand why. And now I see it, why I mentor certain individuals, is that they're smart off the scale. They see things I don't see. And so mentorship, implicitly, you think you're being taught, it's actually a two-way street. It's you're teaching them things they didn't see, even though you think, well, what do I know? I don't know anything. And I'd be coming up with stuff where, 70% was like, no. Steve, we've done that before. Every once in a while, they go, whoa, And so they were getting stuff, which I didn't understand at the time, that made them interested in spending time with me. And for Ben, it lasted a couple decades. For Gordon, I just saw Gordon Bell about a month ago. He came to my 65th birthday party as well. Thank you. But Gordon actually, and we'll talk about Ben. Gordon ended up, in a very long hindsight, to be almost a father figure for me, because I didn't have a father. And Gordon was the world's worst father. I mean, I could not imagine him being dad. But he was like a role model in the way he thought. Ben taught me how to think. Gordon taught me what to think about. And that distinction was, the partnership between Ben and I was, Ben could figure out how to drive down a road in a way that no one else can. I'd figure out how to drive off-road, and that was why it was a great partnership. But Gordon would teach me what the destination was. And it was just a great set of mentors. And what's funny about mentorship is, of course, you get it in a certain period of your life, maybe late 20s to late 30s, and then one day you wake up and you realize it's your turn to be mentored. And that you've, kind of passed the people who've mentored you. Not that you're smarter, but it's now your turn to give back. And so it's almost a bittersweet thing. It's like watching your kids grow up is watching you become that generation of mentorship. And so same with Catherine Gould. I mean, she was my investor and my board member, and then eventually just a good friend. And we'd tell war stories and learn things, and I'd bounce ideas off her, and she bounced deals off of me. But it was that time of in my career that, and back then no one would say, I'm your mentor and you're mentoring me. But in hindsight, I think if you're lucky, you ought to pay attention when people start paying attention to you, because it is a career-changing activity. Sorry, was that?
That's wonderful. Steve, I'm sorry that time
sorry.
moves too fast, and we're
only at conversion. We might need 4 days.
We're only at conversion. Well, we're up to MIPS now, and
sorry.
I know we have 5 more minutes with our media team, and I know 5 minutes is wholly inadequate to even start that story.
Was this all right for?
It's amazing.
Is that all right?
It's fantastic. It's fantastic.
All right.
Well, it's really a privilege, so thank you.
What the hell do I know? But it's it was one hell of a ride in Silicon Valley. It was, and I have to tell you, and stop me if I should
Let's
stop.
continue because we just have a few minutes. Sounds
Yeah.
like Steve's got some reflections here.
So, I wish I could tell you it was all strategy, but some of the things I look back and see that I did is I was fearless because I was too dumb to know it couldn't be done. And as I said, I remember even from the day I came to the Valley, this whole notion of you can't die here. It's impossible to starve to death here, and the weather was great if I had to sleep out on the street. Seriously, I remember thinking that and going, where else in the world? It was like drinking from a fire hose for decades. And for me, getting data and learning new things, remember, I wasn't qualified for any job I ever had. Any job. What did I know about microprocessors or I was teaching it 6 months later. Later on in my career, what did I know about supercomputers? Next month I was teaching a class, R1/2 and infinity and vector scalar startup. I mean, Amdahl's law. What did I know? But it forced me to kind of learn. What did I know about the history of Silicon Valley? In fact, my wife, when I did the secret history of Silicon Valley, she said, Steve, some people would think they'd have to be a qualified historian to actually write the history of Valley. You don't really care, do you? I said, well, no one else wrote it. Maybe someone else will do a better job. Turns out 500,000 downloads later, it is the canonical history of at least the military side. My point was this Valley had this interesting intersection of, you know what? If you want it, go take a shot at it. And both the economics made sense at the time, the culture made sense, the people made sense. It still does, but it really was, the 20th century in the Valley was one heck of a ride.
Thank you so much,
All right.
Steve.